Excellent. So we're on the hour. Welcome back to day 2, everyone. I think we had a very useful day yesterday, clarified quite a lot. And I know the measurement task force then had a very useful meeting yesterday afternoon, digesting all the input that they'd had, or starting to digest all the input that they'd had from the board and the requests. And that will clearly shape what we get back on Thursday. And then we also took the remaining key decisions in terms of the update to Chapter 7 of the conceptual framework. So again, all of these are projects that obviously link together, and what we're trying to do is actually make sure that we've, we're getting consistency, and we're, if you like, essentially firming up on all the various key parts, so that we can get them agreed in an integrated way. And in that theme, we then move on to item 5 on the agenda, which is the update of IPSASB 17 in terms of property, plant and equipment, and bringing in guidance on heritage and infrastructure into that. This is a project that Agustina picked up for the June meeting. And again, we had a good session on that in June, took a lot of key decisions. So this morning is picking up the instructions from that. And then the aim is that we move to an approval subject to a list of final things that need fixing. So that's the agenda for today. And I won't steal Agustina's thunder anymore. Pass over to you, Agustina. Welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, board members, technical advisors, observers, and staff. Today I'll be discussing, as Ian said, the property plan and equipment. First, I would like to start with a brief timeline of what the project has been through, just key items. The project started back in June 2015. It developed the consultation for heritage assets. Between that time and the development of ED 78, there was decisions made where a separate IPSASB will not be created for heritage assets, and we had to look at heritage asset infrastructure assets as being recognized for as property, plant, and equipment. Today, we're seeking the approval of the IPSASB subjects to, and in December, we're planning to complete those subjects to complete this project. So we introduced 5 papers in total. The first one that I would like to discuss is agenda item 521. This agenda item recommends addressing the circularity that was noted between ED 77 and ED 78, specifically on initial measurement. So in this proposal, it will be to remove the cross-reference to ED 77 on initial measurement, and then clarify the scope on ED 77 to reflect which standard is to be applied on initial measurement. With that, I'll pass it to Ian.
Okay, so at that point, open for comments from members on the amendments proposed. Yeah, Lindy, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wonder if we still then need paragraph 25, because it also refers to the measurement ED. Just check paragraph 25. Thanks.
Could you be specific on that at this stage, Lindy? Because obviously we're looking to make, final approvals. So what are we looking for there?
We're saying on initial measurement, we remove paragraph 12, which referred the preparer to the measurement ED for measuring property, plant and equipment. So we've taken it out. But when we talk about subsequent measurement, we still have the paragraph that refers back to the measurement ED. I don't know if we want it there for subsequent measurement where it's not there for initial measurement.
Dave?
Sorry, Lindy, I didn't bring my computer over, but I think we need the paragraph 25 because with initial measurement, we want to continue to use the guidance in ED 78. But for subsequent measurement, we want to refer back to ED 77 or IPSAS measurement for fair value and current operational value.
Okay, just so that I understand that's the intention. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So no change there. Camira and then Mike.
Thanks, Chair. First, I have a general question on the decision for changing the number of the standard. So that's because I've been several times with Focal and other. They ask us why do we decide when there should be a new number to the standard in comparison to IPSAS 17. I thought that originally we were just having some minor additional guidance on infrastructure assets and heritage assets, and perhaps we could keep the same numbering. So that's just a clarification question. Then with the staff recommendation, I partially agree. So the first one of removing, the second, the first one of removing paragraph 12, I do agree with that. But the addition on revising paragraph 5 on exposure draft 77, I think is not very helpful. I think both standards complement each other. So for me, when reading, it's not like one or the other. I think exposure draft 77 explains the concept at a more high level in comparison to IPSAS 45. So and more specifically, I have a couple of other comments. So in paragraph 11 on IPSAS 45, when referring to costs, perhaps just refer to historical costs to be more specific and consistent with exposure draft 77. And then also in paragraph 11, we are referring to deemed cost. Why don't we just mention current value or fair value instead of deemed cost? So that's just a question on me.
So what I'm going to suggest is we just walk through each of those because, for example, on that last one, the reference to deemed cost is a very specific reference. So I don't think we can change that at this stage. But I just want to go to Ross in terms of numbering first, and then I'll go to staff in terms of, I just want to walk through each of those points that you've made there, Camira.
Yeah, thanks. So on the numbering of the standards, the board did think about this and we've considered it, and we've got a precedent when we did IPSAS 39, updating IPSAS 25, the pension standard. And the reason we've decided to go with a new numbered standard is because it gets very messy when you're adding and deleting to an existing standard, taking things out, the paragraph references and the integrity of the standard. And plus there'll be a long implementation period before this standard is applied where they'll continue to apply IPSAS 17. So the preference is to add the new numbered standard. So it's easy for constituents to know which version of property, plant, and equipment they're applying. So they can transition to the new version and then the old version will die and they'll apply IPSAS 45. In terms of the standard itself, a lot of the principles in IPSAS 45 will be consistent with IPSAS 17. And we've in this project worked fairly hard to make sure that we're not amending things that don't need to be updated in IPSAS 17. So, you know, other than the additions we're adding, it's not a significant rewrite of 17. We are still going to be aligned with the underlying IFRS, which again, to the points we'll go through in a minute, that's one of the reasons why we're not making wholesale changes to everything.
Okay, so perhaps we could just step through the other points that you made just in turn and just make sure we understand what's proposed and whether we make a change or not. So you good to go, Agustina?
So regarding your question, Camira, as to not revising ED 77, the scope, when we look at the terminology and the specific guidance that ED 78 has on initial measurement, it's pretty specific to that standard. The elements of cost, measurement, even when you see at ED 77, you're discussing transaction price. So there's different terminology and specific guidance. And that was the thought as to why you should clarify on ED 77 that the specific guidance on the specific IPSAS would apply when it's included. And that's what we have there. regarding the deemed costs, I don't know if you could clarify a little bit more that point.
Sure. With deemed cost, I think in the standard, probably I'm mistaken. It refers to fair value, right? Or market value, not deemed cost, because deemed cost is more terminology of IPSAS 33, but correct me if I'm wrong. So it was just to make it a bit more consistent with ED 77 in terms of terminology, if it's possible, to refer instead of deemed cost just to the current value. And then the preparer will decide if they apply the current operational value or fair value accordingly. But we can discuss this offline.
I think we need to be very careful about making that change at this point in time, because deemed cost was used very deliberately when we developed the exposure draft. You know, broadening it at this stage in the way, I think at this stage in standards development, we have to be really, really careful about making changes, because it has knock-on effects elsewhere. So I think unless there's actually something wrong at the moment, we have been through all the comments and decided whether we're going to make a change or not. So I don't think we should be making that change because of the potential knock-on at this stage. Okay. I don't think there was anything else, was there? So I think we go to Mike at this stage.
So thank you very much. I have just a comment on the terminology at cost, because if you compare it to ED 77, we don't mention at cost as a pure term, but there we mention transaction cost, transaction price. I think that inconsistency is something we consider to avoid. However, I very much in favor of that recommendation here, avoiding circularity.
Dave, do you want to pick that one up?
This goes back to Ross's point a little, where cost has been used in IPSAS 17 for 20, 25 years, and we didn't update that terminology so that when people are applying IPSAS 45, they don't think that we've made any changes to how to account for property, plant, and equipment, or how to measure property, plant, and equipment at cost or historical cost. So I take your point on consistency, but the board decided not to make that change, just to eliminate any confusion on measurement.
What's your hovering on this?
Yeah, maybe to add a little extra color as well. It's also completely aligned with the underlying IFRS as well in this, you know, in terminology. And if we do make a slight change, even for our consistency, then people will assume we might mean something different, and they'll start looking for, you know, basic changes when we're really saying the underlying accounting is not changing at all, especially on initial measurement. So noting the inconsistency, it's not causing problems, and I don't think it will cause problems. Making the change might.
I mean, I'm wondering on this one, whether it wouldn't be appropriate just to add a short BC that just explains that piece of thinking. So I think then that would tie it up without making a change. So if we can add that as an action that needs doing. Okay. So I think with that, we agree the proposed changes by staff. So then move us on to the next item.
So the next agenda item 52.2 is recommending streamlining paragraph 28 and 29. And specifically, this is about subsequent measurement under the current value model. So we streamline the paragraphs to reflect that what drives the decision between fair value and current operational value is the primary objective why the entity holds the asset. Does the IPSASB agree with the recommendation?
Thanks, Agustina. And you have the changes in markup there. Renee. And then Liang.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with the change, but I noted another area in paragraph 21. So if you could look at 21 and related to 21, 22, and 23, we're only referring to fair value. And I think maybe in those spots, we should refer to both, add the current operating value. Thank you.
Could I just have a quick staff reaction on that, please?
So Renee, I think that 2021, those early paragraphs refer to initial measurement at cost. And the board discussed that when you're measuring an item, initially current operational value wasn't appropriate. If you're transacting with a third party, fair value was a more appropriate price because it was a market price. So as a result, that's why current operational value is not included in those paragraphs.
Ross.
Yeah, and 21 in particular is dealing with assets received through non-exchange transactions, and consistent with our literature, you recognize those at fair value. So same with inventory and other assets.
You okay on that, Renee? Okay, thanks. So Liang, and then I've got Lucy online at the moment. So Liang next.
Thanks, Chair. I agree the new paragraph of 27, but I'm thinking whether it is necessary for us to revise the definition of class of PPE, because here we indicate the entire class of PPE should have the same objective of holding. But from the definition of class of PPE in paragraph 5, it means a grouping of assets of a similar nature or function in an entity's operation. I feel from the definition, similar nature or function may not mean have the same objective to hold the asset. So should we change the definition of class a little? This is my first point.
Do you want to make your second point then, Liang, and
Yep.
and then I'll ask staff just to react on that.
My second point is about the paragraph to be deleted about paragraph let me see. 29. I think in practice, if the primary objective to hold the asset has changed, should we change the measurement basis accordingly? For example, we discussed about the school yesterday. If the school originally it is for public interest, it is a public interest, and then we change the purpose, such as we change to something to generate the income. I think we need to change the measurement basis accordingly. So I would suggest that we do not delete the entire paragraph 29, but just to state if the objective to hold the asset changed, we should revisit the measurement basis, and there may be chance that the measurement basis should change, such as COV to the fair value.
Thanks, Liang. So perhaps if I can get staff to react. I mean, I think this is probably implicit, and the problem I think we have is that actually quite a lot of work has been put into redrafting 27 and 28 to address other member comments. So the question is there really a problem that we haven't addressed or we've inadvertently? So Agustina, if I can, if you can come back on the 2 points Liang has made.
Yeah, so we'll definitely take away the point about the definition to think it through. Regarding your second point as to removing that part about when the change is appropriate, thought was that on IPSAS 3, if you were to change the measurement basis, it will be done because an event has happened that does no longer make that measurement base to be representative for the information. So the thought was that IPSAS 3 has the guidance to tell you when would be appropriate to change the measurement basis. And in your example with the school, if you suddenly change the objective, it will reflect that. At the same time, having that clarity within the core text is something that we could take away from the redrafting point that you have suggested. But the thought when it was removed is that IPSAS 3 has the guidance as to what would drive you to make such a change from a policy perspective.
I think it is not the same thing as IPSASB 3 because in this standard we emphasize that the class the objective to hold the asset depends regulates the class of the measurement basis. So I think we need to emphasize again here if the objective to hold the asset changed, the measurement basis should change accordingly.
Okay, we'll take that away. I would just say to members, we always face this when we get to this session, which is actually, please can you think, is this something that is a fatal flaw, or is it something that I would like to see but hasn't actually been there before? Because we have exposed this text, we haven't had comments from constituents, and therefore, you know, frankly, we have to be really, really, really clear as to why we need to make a change at this stage. You know, we're not in a position where we can start dealing with board drafting preference. It's actually, is there something that's actually wrong? Because otherwise we can't get this to settle and we will keep spinning the wheels. So I am going to be quite hard in terms of whether we accept comments or not, and whether we add to the list of subject twos. So if I can preface the further debate on this with that, you know, we do have to be really clear as to what the change is being proposed and why there is something wrong in the text at the moment. Okay, so we will take those two changes, Liang, and think about them. But I think, you know, we have to be really clear, because the risk, and I've seen it happen in these sessions before, is that we make a change and in doing that, we inadvertently disturb something else. And this has to sit in our literature. It has to interface with all the other parts of our literature. So we need to be really deliberate as to what the problem is and why that is a fix that won't impact anywhere else. Okay, with that, we note those 2 points and those will be added to the list of subject twos. And I will move on then to Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with the staff recommendation
You're on mute, Lucy, I think.
No,
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Chair? Okay, thank you very much. I agree with the staff recommendation to revise the drafting of the draft IPSAS 45 on the selection of measurement basis in the current value model. And I believe that giving emphasis on the decision between measurement basis in the current value model as guided by the primary objective of why the asset is held would really provide guidance when measuring PPE, since the selection is not based entirely on the entity's discretion, but also requires considerations of other factors such as the entity's objective in holding the asset. I just have some concern. I think there appears to be an issue now on the applicability of the existing use principle in the COV, as the existing utilization of the asset may not necessarily be aligned with the primary objective of why the asset is held. Of course, we all know that save for commercial public sector entities whose primary objective is to hold assets for financial capacity, most public sector entities hold assets primarily for operational capacity, and therefore it will lead the users the choice of as the measurement basis, taking into consideration this primary objective. Our discussion yesterday on the possible split of choices in measuring part of a hospital building used for operational capacity using COV and the other part used for financial capacity using the fair value seems not supported with or not aligned to the new paragraph 27, which provides users the choice of COV or fair value in measuring the entire class of PPE. So I suggest that we revisit the existing use principle in the COV in light of the primary objective of why an asset is held as the principal consideration in choosing COV. Further, I think the proposed paragraph 27, to my mind, rules out the surplus or excess capacity principle we have lengthily discussed yesterday because public sector entities, for all intent and purposes, would really like to optimize the use of resources in public service delivery to get the value for the money. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we have to be very careful about the interaction between the standards here. Ross, you want to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of points of reflection. So one, we've got the subject to for the finalization of current operational value. So I think we need to let that play out before we make decisions on how that's going to be reflected in the final guidance here. But I would note that the ability for the entity to select based on how it's using the asset, whether to on the current value basis do fair value or current operational value, was in the exposure draft and highly supported. And although I agree with your point that in the public sector, service delivery is the main objective of most public sector entities, in our literature, we do have instances where real assets can be carried at because of their financial capacity at fair value. And I don't think we should preclude the option and entities the ability to use it here, and that's in line with what was in the exposure draft that was highly supported. So I don't think we should make any changes.
So, but as Ross said, we do have a subject too, which is obviously we do need to conclude the process and implement the decisions that we made yesterday on COV and surplus capacity. And so there will be that's one of the subject to items that if there needs to be a change. But I think the points that Ross has made, we did allow for when we actually developed this. So I think there's a high threshold in terms of whether we would see any fatal flaws that our constituents haven't picked up and the board didn't see when it actually approved the ED. Okay, so if I can go to Lynn and then to Camira.
Thanks, Ian. So I had similar points to Liang around items and around class, just to note that in the first instance. I also had similar points to Lucy. Obviously, when we look at particularly AG 26 and AG 27, and it talks about and our discussion yesterday around excess capacity almost conflicts already with these paragraphs, so they will need to be looked at. And again, that comes back to item of account, maybe when do you separate an asset, when do you separate a physical asset into more than one class if you're going to hold excess capacity at fair value? So I do think we would need to look at that, because this is saying, what is my primary objective? And when you've got assets with excess capacity, your primary objective is still the service delivery, and that these paragraphs would drive you to COV for the lot. So that does need to be looked at. I wanted to raise and it's on BC 42, but I guess it's a point, and I think there's an opportunity in BC 42. One of the points that we had yesterday was just being really clear, and perhaps it's in the BCs, and this could be the place to do it, that PPE will include operational assets held for their financial capacity. Now, the trouble is with the wording here, isn't it? Your PPE will include assets held for their financial capacity. It is possible for the public sector to hold PPE assets, use them in their operations, and want to drive a financial return from them. And I think we should be really clear on that. BC 42, I sort of struggled with the wording here. I found it a bit confusing and felt there was an opportunity to state really clearly that we concluded that PPE could where appropriate, include assets held for their financial capacity.
Thanks, then I think we can achieve that clarification. So we had that. I think there's some review BCs on the subject too, so we'll specifically note that. Dave.
I just wanted to come back quickly, Lynn, on AG 26 and 27. I read 26 and 27 as, when I read assets, I guess the example we always talk about is a building and maybe one of the floors is held for something outside of service capacity. So I read AG 26 and 27 as either the entity has to decide whether their asset is the building, or whether each floor is an asset, or 4 floors are an asset and the 5th floor is a different asset. I don't read a contradiction in kind of what you're proposing, what AG 26 and 27 are saying.
Thanks.
So
Lynn,
if I could
back on
if I could come back on that. So there are places in this standard where it talks about item, places where it talks about asset, and maybe it's in implementation guidance. But when most people read asset, they instinctively think of the building in its entirety. We need to be clear that and again, this is, some places it's used as items, some places it's used as asset, but I think we need to be clear about what our unit of account is. And it may not be what intuitively people will think, which is, what is my building in its entirety? So, or what is my site? So I think that does need clarifying. It could be in AG, it could be in IG, it could be in the standard itself, but I don't think it's very clear at the moment.
So in the instruction, I think one of the things we do have to do is actually work out, because quite often what we find is we're picking up a problem that is in the IPSASB's literature. So I think the question is actually, are those references, firstly, are those existing references in the underlying, I think it's an IAS, not even an IFRS, and then is that just a consistency thing, or is it actually, is there a requirement for clarification over that item versus asset? So I think that's a reasonable instruction to make, just to tidy that up. Todd, and I don't want to re-debate this at this stage. I'd rather actually leave staff to go away and actually just really work all that through, because I don't think it really changes. It's a clarification rather than any change of substance. Todd.
I support what Lynn's saying, and I think it is something that we need to deal with, because we've got both COV and fair value here. The IASB only has fair value, so they don't have the same issue that we're trying to address here. And I think it's something that needs to be dealt with at the standard level, because the confusion will come in from reading the actual standard. So it's not something that can be left for application or implementation guidance in my mind. We have to be clear up front, because we've got these 2 bases.
Okay, thanks, Todd. I think that helps in terms of clarifying the point, but also I think in terms of clarifying the actions for staff. And that would give us a reason, if there is a problem with the underlying IFRS literature, that actually we clarify for the public sector because of the COV interaction. So thanks, I think that's helpful. Okay, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I disagree with removing the paragraph 29. And this is just a question for the staff. I do not remember correctly. Do we have an SMC on that, and having the option of between fair value and current operational value? And did respondents supported having this option? So that is one question. And my reasons why I consider we should retain this is, and it was very clear for me after you provide an example of in the documents, there was a hospital that has the same machines, 2 machines, exactly the same, but one was in one building that was for operational capacity, and another was in a building for financial capacity. And then I personally do not think we should, the measurement should vary. So if they are the same machine, why should we provide a different value to each one? So I think the objective, so the primary objective, why the entity holds the assets, should not lead definitely the measurement base that they are selecting. Perhaps we should take a look on the availability of the data, on how the measurement base meets the qualitative characteristic or something more objective, but not, because in that example you provided, it's clear for me, why do we need to add some additional work burden, workload to preparers if we are talking about exactly the same machine? Why do they need to calculate or apply two different measurement bases? So that's my concern. Thanks.
Thanks. Ross, do you want to respond on that?
So I think we already agreed we're taking another look at that from Liang's intervention. So it's one of the subject twos.
Okay. Fine. So let's move on then to the next item.
So the next item from the instructions from the June meeting was to look at heritage asset characteristics. Specifically, the ask from the board was to consider reflecting that heritage assets has both restrictions on their use and their disposal. And the recommendation is to add that heritage assets have a restriction on their disposal as well. Does the IPSASB agree with the recommendation?
Thanks, Agustina. We content with that change? Good. I think that's helpful. Okay. Oh, sorry, Lindy.
I'm just trying to find my space. I think there was something on the BCs where we said only, and I just thought maybe it was a bit harsh. I think it's in there. But I can, when I find it, I can raise it again. I think it was just let me find it and I'll tell you.
Is this a BC point?
And only that, and I think maybe it's
Okay, I think we can pick that up separately. Okay. So move us on then to the next item.
Okay, the next item discusses the next agenda item 5.2.4. It has several instructions that were addressed. One of them was the IPSASB requested to consider adding a cross-reference to ED 77 on the selection of measurement basis. Staff is recommending not to add a cross-reference specific to that, as ED 78 has guidance on the selection of measurement basis on the application guidance, and ED 77 has generic information. So the application guidance currently in ED 78 addresses that.
Everyone content with that? Okay, that's good. So then we move, sorry. Oh, Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with the changes, and also on the I just noted that there is with an exception of a minor revision in the terminology used in the proposed update in agenda item 7.2.9 instruction. And as pointed out also previously by Lynn, that there are inconsistencies on the use of the word items to asset. So it is still not incorporated in paragraph 36 of the draft IPSAS 45. I also noted some inconsistencies in the analysis in agenda item 7.2.5 on page 18 of the PDF, because it says that I think the analysis have been interchanged with the basis of conclusion, referring to BC 17 is about BC 17 actually discusses the IPSASB decision on what characteristics should be included in the draft IPSAS 45, but in the analysis, it was stated that this is in BC 18. And also BC, in the analysis, BC 17 says that it reflects the IPSASB decision to update examples, but actually this is BC 18. Thank you.
Agustina?
Thanks, Lucy. I think we got your feedback across the instructions on that particular paper. Yes, on the paper, the numbering has changed as modifications were made to the standard, and that's why I kind of highlighted on a footnote that the BC was different. But possibly they seem to be drafting comments, so I could address them with you offline after the meeting, if that's okay.
To BCs. Yeah, okay, I'll do that. So I'm on item A here at the moment. Everybody content that they're with the way and that's been actioned? Camilla, are you in on that or? Put the flag down. Okay, so let's move on to item B, which is the additional IG.
Yes, and just to clarify, I'm planning to go instruction by instruction, just to discuss them in case board members have comments. So the next instruction from the June meeting was to add guidance to clarify that an entity can have more than one class of property, plant, and equipment when the objective as to why the asset is being held is different. And to that purpose, an IG 26 was added to reflect that. And that example is regarding the MRI machines. And I'll pass the mic to Ian. Thank you.
Thanks, Agustina. Lindy, you're in on this.
Thank you. Well, I agree with the IG and the wording. I think it also relates to this whole class thing. So we have a definition of a class in the paragraph 5. In paragraph 36 or 37, we explain what classes are. But then when we go to the disclosures, we picked up the disclosures from the fair value and we said these are the disclosures for fair value and current operating model. And this is paragraph 83 to 85. In paragraph 85, it then has a different definition of a class. So it says when you do disclosures, this is how you determine your class for fair value and for current operational value. And specifically, it says about your observable inputs for current operational value and your levels in the fair value hierarchy. So I think there is just an inconsistency there on how we deal with classes. I don't have a suggestion, but I think it's something we need to look at.
I think what we need to do here is we need to set up a specific drafting group of those who are interested in this area so that we can actually fix this in a coherent way, because I'm worried that we're getting a whole series of comments being picked up. And you know, I think back to Todd's point, some of this is because of introducing COV. Some of it is actually because we've got a lack of clarity and inconsistency in the underlying literature in any case that we've drawn this from. And I think we need to actually make any changes very deliberately and very clearly, and be clear about if we're making a change from the underlying IAS, why is it we're making that change? So I think what I want to do is pick this up as a holistic point rather than anything else. And it may just be the classic thing where there are, you know, English language alternatives applied rather than just using the same term consistently. So I don't want to debate it at this stage. I think there's an action that we just need to actually clear it. Todd, final point, and then I want to move on because we're just kind of going round and round this and we're not going to solve it in the board.
I was just going to make a suggestion. I think a drafting group's a good idea. We have the time at the end of sessions, so it's something that if we're keen to try and get as far as we can to a point where we'd be comfortable to approve, it may be worth a group of people taking a couple of hours out to try and get through this afternoon or tomorrow.
Okay. I mean, you know, I think we'll need to come back to this and say, is this really actually something that would actually detain us in terms of actually at least giving approval in principle, subject to, because it's not going to change the overall standard. And again, you know, the problem that we're having at the moment is people are picking at various different things. And the risk is that we end up disturbing something because we're trying to do this in committee at a late stage, and that is always a risk. So I think, okay, we'll have a drafting group on this, but I think it needs to pick up all of these things that people have picked up on and just have a consistent, coherent solution to it. Okay, so then we move on to C.
Yeah, so on C, we revised the drafting of BC 17, which used to be BC 16 in ED 78. So the instruction was to reflect that the characteristics included in the standard for heritage assets and infrastructure assets, specifically on AG3 and AG6, is not an exhaustive list. So this BC was revised and drafting was included for your review. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. People consent with that change? Okay, that's good. So move us on to D.
So the next instruction was on SMC4, which was specific about infrastructure assets characteristics. The board requested to look at whether existing BCs acknowledge the comments received and they needed to be further expanded. After the review from staff, we see that all of the VCs acknowledge these recommendations made on SMC4, so no further VCs are being recommended on that.
Thanks, Agustina. Any member comments on that? Okay, good. Thanks for that.
Okay, on item number E, the board requested to add a VC to communicate the purpose of the additional guidance issue and the board expectation that this item is not being foreseen to be reopened, and a VC was added for that and drafted was included for your input.
Lindy, on that.
Thank you. I do wonder if the last part around we don't expect to initiate another project in the foreseeable future should be in more communication material rather than the BC. I think also if you make it obvious, they might think, oh, but maybe we should ask for something.
Thanks, Lindy. So you're suggesting deletion of that final sentence there. And I think that's right from a point of view of the convention in the board is that we don't bind our successors. And I think in a sense that's actually doing that. So if we include that BC up as far as was issued, and then we delete from there onwards. Everyone consent with that? David?
Thank you. I just wondered whether actually the first part of that last sentence is appropriate, because we're actually reinforcing the point that it is applicable to all PPE. So actually sort of stop after property, plant and equipment, full stop, and delete that last bit.
We okay with that? I think it is that last bit which was causing the problem. Okay, fine. Thanks for that.
Okay, the next instruction was revising or shortening the application guidance AG8 to AG15, which was discussed in the definition of an asset. This guidance was streamlined and the information kept was specific to heritage asset being a resource and assessment of control, and drafting was provided for the IPSASB review.
We consent with what's been done. Camira.
Chair, I think we remove a bit too much. And for instance, in AG8, we are just mentioning, yes, the PPA and E must meet all asset free criteria. Okay, what are those criteria? And we should explain what are those criteria so that people don't need to go back to IPSAS 1. And I was also reading the analysis and I see that the staff decided not to cite the conceptual framework because it is non-authoritative. Could you please elaborate a bit more? Because I do consider that the conceptual framework had very useful information on the definition of an asset and what we have been working in the last months on this. And I don't know if that is a restriction that we cannot cite it because that will be helpful if we are removing so much information here. Thanks.
Ross.
I think it was more, so the standard itself already has the guidance on when you have PP&E and when you recognize it. So duplicating verbatim what's in the framework isn't really adding much to what's specifically there. It's, from addressing the instruction when we're asked to clarify it and remove things because we were just repeating the framework, which was the request from another member, which is why we took it out. And again, the framework is there for people to look through as a non-authoritative document, but it's for the board to do in setting its standards. It's not, when you're talking real assets and PP&E, I don't think it's a big issue on when you actually really have an asset. It's really about the control. So that's where the focus is. So that's why we've clarified in that way. We've actioned the instruction the board asked for. We've taken it out.
I mean, I think at this stage, if members want something back, then what we need is actually something that actually is clear about what you're actually looking for. Because, staff have actioned what the board requested, and we can't have a ping pong going backwards and forwards just because there's a preference in terms of the way that a point has been actioned. So I think if members want material back in, then we're looking for a specific suggestion on that. So I'll leave that point open. But, again, it's about consistency between material and so on. So, we don't want to keep rewriting things and having it in two different places. That's the convention that we adopt. So I'll leave that point open from that point of view, but I need a specific suggestion on that to come back later if you want something back in. Lindy.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the staff analysis should say that, well, we're using the IPSASB definition of an asset because the conceptual framework, we're still looking at the revising the definition and we haven't yet incorporated that in the literature. So we're using the current authoritative definition, which is IPSAS1. So it's correct to have it the way we've amended it.
Okay, thanks. So I think the point remains that actually if is a counter proposal to bring something back in, then we need to actually have a specific suggestion as to what members are looking for. Okay.
So the next last instruction was a revised drafting of authoritative guidance to reconcile the terminology on electricity transmission networks across the standard. So this was done and redundancies were removed as appropriate. I know, Lucy, you had a comment earlier on and we could discuss it as a part of this afternoon.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? No. Okay, fine. So move us on then to the next stage.
Okay, so the next stage is agenda item 5.2.5, which looks to the approval of IPSAS 45 subjects to. In front of you, we have the different subjects to that we have noted ahead of this meeting, which are the approval of draft IPSAS 77, the measurement, staff to consider the development of non-authoritative guidance for the valuation of heritage assets by involving the measurement task force. The third one is a staff to review consistency of amendments of other IPSAS with IPSASB decision in June 2022 and in September right now. When the draft of measurement will be approved or is expected to be approved. The fourth one is a staff to complete the comparison of IPSAS 45 with IS 16 and GFS. And the fifth one is a staff to draft final BCs based on the decision both in June and in September.
And then we have a couple of other items that issue around class, the AG 29 paragraph, and then there was the one other point, I think, or is that part of that class issue? Yeah. So we have two additional points then. Okay. So I think the question is, given that list, where is the board at the moment in terms of is the board content to move ahead with approval subject to, and this is a process that we've used before, because essentially what we're trying to do is actually lock down text that has been agreed, and then focus us on the items that still need to be agreed in order to approve the standard. Ross.
Maybe as a reminder for members, I can kind of walk you through how that process will work when we've used it in the past. So we do the official vote today, and then when we document it in the minutes, the board approved subject to the specific items that are on the slide and the 3 additional items from today. And then staff will bring papers back on each item so that the board can finalize the approval. So once they agree the resolution of each of the subject twos, the approval becomes finalized. Now, the reason the board decided to take this approach in June is because, primarily we were there except for COV and the items noted today, and we're running into quite a busy agenda in December in terms of approvals. So it takes a lot of board headspace to review a full document. So we wanted to try and pull forward the thinking a little bit and get the approval in place. So we have limited items to review when we bring it back. But it's up to the board to decide if they're comfortable with that process or not.
Todd.
I do have some concerns about the approval of this subject to, and I think it's because of where we're at on COV. And I think as we get clarity on that, some of the changes that we see are going to be across the standard. So we'll be approving subject to, and there could actually be quite a lot of consequential changes once COV lands. And I think that's my concern about approving it, because of the amount of material that will be through. It's not like we just focus on 2 or 3 pages where there's going to be change. In my view, it could be a lot more pervasive than that in my mind at this point.
Can we just be clear about the fact that actually ED 77 and the measurement standard and this standard are actually 2 different standards in terms of nature? So if you like, the measurement standard actually is a higher level standard than we have elsewhere in our literature. It sits somewhere between the detailed guidance, which this is an example of, and the conceptual framework. And we always knew that in moving into this project. So essentially, wherever we use COV in this standard, actually that is COV as we've developed and defined in ED 77. So if you like, how we've actually defined it and so on, wherever we use that, that will affect the interpretation of that, but it's not actually going to change how it's used in connection with property, plants and equipment. And I think that's one of the things that as a board we have to be clear about. So this is applying, and I think there is a question around actually, given we've developed this with those consequences in mind, there shouldn't be changes when we change the guide, when we clarify as a result of yesterday. So I think that's, except this is a different situation, but I think that's one of the things that, we should not be expecting changes in this standard because of clarification regarding what COV actually is. We're using it here. Todd, back on that.
An example, I think we could have to relook at some of the disclosures, because we have a concept of COV in terms of what disclosures we want. And if where we land on COV is basically the technique's going to be the cost approach, well, there will be some things that I think we'd need to revisit in the disclosures, for example. So I think, I do think there is some linkages here that are more than, that will require changes to the words in the standard once we've worked through COV. I'm just highlighting that because I think it is quite real, because we haven't actually landed everything to do with COV. And I think disclosures is certainly one area that I think there will need to be some consequential changes just based on our conversations yesterday. And that's one example.
Okay, I'll take comments. I think I would caution us, though, we are going to get into chicken and egg territory here. And we can't keep everything open all the way through. We've got to actually land stuff, and that's what this is trying to do, not to constrain the fact that there will be changes, but actually let's just agree on what we have agreed, and let's be clear about where there might be consequentials, but we have to lock something down first. And that's what this proposal actually is that we lock this first subject to, and then it literally is consequentials from the other thing. So I'll go around the table. So I'll go to Lynn, Camira, Chris, and then Claudia.
So I do support Todd's concern about the extent of the subject twos. That's said, and my nervousness comes from we haven't had Thursday's debate following the debate yesterday. All of that said, I think I would be happy to, I assume we're going to do a page turn and people in a moment, and people might have comments, because I do have a couple of other comments on the standard, but I would be happy as a board member to, from this point after today, see all of the track changes accepted, and from this point onwards then see a tracked change version of anything that's happened after today. To my mind, I think that might help board members in then tracking what's happened post today, where we don't really want to change anything until we feel we need to. Having done that, though, I think actually we shouldn't vote on it today. I would prefer a later vote on it.
Thanks, then. I'll move on round before we come back with the proposal on how we move forward. Camira, then Chris, then Claudia.
Thanks, Chair. I'm also concerned about approving the exposure draft today, particularly because of this option of between the current operational value and the fair value. So what we discussed, and this task will analyze it, because that could also have changes in the implementation guidance, the example that you have provided. So I think I would prefer also to vote on this later. Thanks.
Okay, Chris, and then Claudia.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to caution us about our deviation from, just to caution us about being apologetic that we have deviated from or departed from IFRS on this COV. We've done a lot of work to develop COV to this level. And for crying out loud, we are a public sector standard setter. And COV is primarily a public sector instrument. So I just want to caution, in all that we're trying to add and subtract and all that, we should not touch COV. We should not be apologetic about it. So I agree with colleagues that we could suspend the approval today, but we must not touch COV. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Claudia.
Thank you. I would add something to Todd, Lynn, and Camira, that I didn't feel quite safe if we have really all instruction for COV in the standard as it is. I can understand that we have a subject 2 so that we agree on all others without the whole CUV point. That solves also the issue what I brought up to Agustina, that we have to think about the transition provision. If we change from the old fair value definition in the standard to a new CUV for the operating capacity, if we need a transition provision on this aspect or not, I don't know. But that we can have really a whole look when we know, okay, now we are safe. What does CUV mean? Now it's fit into PP&E. Also the first time when we use the CUV, that it's, I think, helps a lot, because then we really know what we are talking about.
So I think you've made 2 points there. So can I just deal with the transition, because I think that's a different issue from do we approve the standard? So can we just deal with the specific, and then we'll come back on the process?
Yes, on the transition, we discussed it, Claudia. Right now, our transition paragraph says it's retrospective application on ED 78 when it is adopted. So you wouldn't necessarily, I think, have, we can talk details after, but it will be retrospective application at this time.
Okay. So I think we have agreed a number of changes today, which are marked up in the version that you've seen. There are a number of smaller changes that have actually been requested and agreed. There are some changes which need to be just worked through. So in terms of moving forward, clearly members are not in a position where they feel content to approve at this stage. In particular, we've got the proposal of the drafting group in terms of that issue around class and so on. So I think the proposal would be that actually what we do is we bring back on Thursday consequential changes made as a result of those further pieces of work and that group meeting on drafting, and that we switch the order on Thursday so that we deal with the follow-up session on measurement before we get to the session on approval, so that members can understand what's going on in terms of COV. And we won't be dealing with drafting on COV on Thursday. It'll be the changes in principle arising from the instructions that board members made yesterday. And then we will come back with an updated version of the potential list of subject twos at that stage. You know, probably at that stage, for example, we might split out Todd's point about disclosures from others, which is actually just a consistency point. And I think that would help members. I mean, if you look at this list, for example, 4 is not substantive. Those are the boxes at the back of the standard, which are non-authoritative, they're just descriptive. So this is not a change of any substance whatsoever. And I think we just need to be clear about what are the areas where there are substantive change, as opposed to what are the areas which are purely editorial, consequential, etc. And I think that might help the board if we split the list of subject twos in that way, so that we are really clear at this stage what are the further changes that have been proposed as a result of this meeting, and what the substantive changes actually are. And, you know, if we approve subject to the finalisation of COV, that is not precluding any changes coming back for discussion if they are in substance changes other than just editorial. It's just a way of actually trying to settle the rest of the text so that we can be, you know, we can clear, if you like, the undergrowth and just be you know, focus on the changes purely as a result of introducing COV, which, as Chris reminded us, is a very important development in public sector reporting. So are people, you know, content to proceed on that basis? Clearly, if we hit problems again on Thursday, then we'll have to have another look at this. You know, it's just being mindful of the fact that this is a volunteer board, and therefore we're trying to minimise the amount of material that you have to keep going back round. And Lynn, if you've got sort of drafting changes and so on, I would suggest that we take those with staff at the moment, and then if necessary, we bring them back for debate. Lynn?
So I guess my more substantive point is in the section of standard that talks about derecognition, para 64, we've got no reference to our new IPSAS 44 assets held for sale in that section. And I think we should. I think that's more than an editorial point. I think it is a principled point around the derecognition section. So I would like to see, I don't know if that means it needs to be elevated to a subject 2, but I think there's a tension that we need to give in the derecognition section to the new standard.
Thanks for picking that up, Lynn. So my suggestion would be that if you work with staff on that, and then we bring any change back resulting from that. But I think you're right. That certainly looks like a change that should be made. So thanks for that. Claudia, are you still in? Okay. So I think with those clarifications, we'll see the changes back on Thursday. The drafting group will meet in between to sort out that nest of points that were brought up around class and so on. And then we will consider again whether the board feels content at that stage to give a subject to approval. And just to underline, if there are substantive changes that come back out of that process, then the board will need to re-deliberate those changes. So it's not trying to curtail debate, it's just trying to make sure that we are focused on the task in hand. Okay, so with that, thank you, Agustina. And we now move on to the session on revenue and transfer expenses. In particular, we're going to look in detail at the first draft that we've seen on transfer expenses. And I think this is a very important point for the board. So welcome Edwin and Eileen to the table. Okay, so we just wait for the slides to come up for this item. Oh, you need to click, apparently. They're all on one carousel. Great. Okay, Eileen, to you first, I think.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time, as always. As Ian mentioned, today we'll be focusing on transfer expenses as well as revenue. Now, because we are at a pivotal point with both projects, we did want to take a time to just step back and talk about the project strategically and where we are, how far we've come, and what we're planning next for Q4. Now, the IPSASB began reviewing responses to the revenue EDs, which was 70 and 71, as well as the transfer expense ED 72, back in December 2020. And the intention was to first focus on refining and finalizing accounting principles related to both revenue and transfer expenses before actually working on the non-authoritative guidance. Now, staff have outlined the approach that we have taken with the board during this phase of the projects and how the drafting group, which the board had established last year to support it in the detailed review of drafting in the proposed standards, has overall supported the work that's been completed to date. And this is all outlined in the paper. Overall, there has been substantial progress made on both projects, and so staff wanted to provide a project timeline to communicate proposed next steps leading to the plan approval in December. Now, for revenue, authoritative text of the draft IPSAS, which is the core text and the application guidance, has reflected all of the IPSASB's D&Is on principle-related issues. And this is just subject to the decision that we'll be making today on the disclosure for compelled transactions, which will be agenda item 6.2.7. Now, this authoritative guidance has been reviewed extensively by our drafting group and presented to the board on a quarterly basis. And so this has been happening since June 2021. And this quarter, we've actually migrated it from the narrative-based tabular format to our standard format so that it's easier to read and easier to follow how we've done signposting, put in paragraph referencing, seeing it all tied together. And so the board and staff will be pivoting and has already started pivoting to fully focus on non-authoritative guidance. And this is going to be presented in the visual here. Basis for conclusions, we have been working on the side as we are progressing through decisions. But this quarter, today specifically, we will be presenting a list of proposed IG topics later today. And based on this discussion, we will then work with the drafting group to actually write the remaining IGs based on the board decisions today. And these will be presented to the board for review by exception in Q4. This approach is consistent with the board's process on previous projects such as IPSAS 41. Staff will also continue to review and will present a list of proposed IEs, illustrative examples, in October, and will work with the drafting group over the remainder of Q4 on the drafting of the IEs. Similar to the IG process, staff and the drafting group will then present these IEs to the board for review by exception in December. Now, on the transfer expense side,
could we just pause?
Yeah.
Because there's quite a lot to absorb there, and I want to make sure that board members are clear on that process. In particular, when we were developing IPSAS 41 on financial instruments, we were very mindful of the fact that IG, the implementation guides, implementation examples were really important for constituents, but they were non-authoritative in nature. And therefore, what we didn't want to do was take up board time unnecessarily by going through the drafting. What in that case, they will work through in detail by the task force on the board's behalf, with the board having the opportunity to look at the finished result and to bring up any points of concern by exception. And that's very much the process that we're trying to go through here, so that the drafting group will have seen on behalf of the board those IG and those IE before they come to the board. And certainly I think board members felt very comfortable with that process in terms of financial instruments. So we felt that was a good way to proceed here. But just to say that that does not preclude any member actually bringing any points up from that non-authoritative material. That's just a way of handling the volume and making sure that we focus board time where it's appropriate. So that was really just, we wanted to make sure people were clear on the proposal and to make sure that the board as a whole was happy that that was what the drafting group in essence is doing the heavy lifting for you. Okay. So then take us into transfer expenses, which is in a slightly different place.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of transfer expenses, the current authoritative text of the drafts as IPSAS is presented in agenda item 6.3.1 today, and that reflects all the IPSASB's DNIs on principal related issues, subject to 3 of the issue papers that we'll be discussing today. Now, this authoritative guidance was first presented to and reviewed by the drafting group during this quarter, specifically in August, and is now being presented to the board today. Now, the board and staff are continuing to wrap up authoritative work this quarter through the discussions on the issue papers, and Q4 will then focus on non-authoritative guidance as presented in this visual here. So for IGs, and we'll go into why we proposed IGs this time later in the session today, but staff have already presented a list of IG topics that we think would be useful to add into the transfer expense IPSAS. Based on the board's decisions today, we will then work on the drafting with the drafting group during Q4. And as outlined in the earlier process and reiterated by the chair, we will be presenting them to the board for review by exception. Similarly, for the illustrative examples, we'll be considering and presenting a list after in October, and then working with the drafting group over the remaining of Q4 on the drafting of these IEs, and then to present anything by exception to the board in December. I just wanted to reiterate what the chair has said, that members are all encouraged to reach out to staff offline if you have any specific questions about the text so far or any other comments you would like to make on the progress of the two projects. Thank you.
And the principal difference to the board between the two is the fact that we will be doing a page by page in terms of the draft of transfer expenses that you see today, because that's the first time, and it is, you know, considerably different to text that in the ED 72. Adrian.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Eileen. Could you elaborate a bit on the re-exposure issue?
Ross, do you want to just go through the process on that?
Yeah, so from the re-exposure perspective, the way it works in terms of due process is the board will approve a final pronouncement and then immediately consider whether there's a need to re-expose. And in due process, it says you re-expose when there's been a significant change from the exposure draft that hasn't been appropriately considered by constituents. So you want to put it out for them to consider whether or not they agree with the board's thinking when you've changed significantly from the original exposure draft. To help with that decision in December, staff will be doing a paper for both transfer expenses and the revenue EDs to outline the key changes from the exposure draft to the final pronouncement that you'll be approving. And there'll be a recommendation from staff on both of those items on whether or not, in staff's view, there's a need for re-exposure or not, with analysis supporting whichever way the recommendation goes. We haven't worked on that specifically yet. We've been thinking about it. We've had lots of discussions, but we have to actually draft that paper that gives a clear steer to the board on both of the items and the recommendation. But obviously from the work program, we've indicated that it's possible that there might be in a situation where we have to re-expose both.
Back on that, Adrian.
Sorry to put an additional question. Well, I'm rather junior in this board, so I don't know everything about the due process. What I don't understand is the consistency of approving a final pronouncement and immediately at the same time re-expose. I would have thought that we would re-expose on the basis of a draft final pronouncement before the final approval by the board of the final pronouncement. So what's the consistency of it?
So, I mean, the idea is that the exposure draft, and this is written down in detail, when we put out an exposure draft, it should be the guidance that the board would approve if there were no comments from constituents. Now, practically speaking, we always get comments and that's what we want. But the idea is actually that in approving the exposure draft, you're approving that draft. Now, that's where we face a different situation here, because obviously we had a previous exposure draft on transfer expenses as an example, ED 72, and the reason why we're particularly expecting that draft final standard, if we can call it that way, would need to be put out again is because we've actually changed it quite significantly. Ross.
Yeah, maybe more generally to your point on why it's set up that way. So the due process for all of the IFAC related standard setting boards are set up similarly. So the audit board, ethics board, and our board. And from the perspective of why it's in that exact cadence, it's so the board's kind of forced to think about what would make that final standard and not constantly be in exposure draft mode that, well, we're going to ask questions. Because again, when we approve these final standards and then put them out for re-exposure, the thinking is you wouldn't have a lot of SMCs and open questions because the board's formed its views on what would make the final standard. It's just that final check on re-exposure if those areas where you've made significant changes are appropriate or not. You're not looking to reopen every part of the standard again and get feedback on everything, so that you're not constantly just working on the same project for years and years and years.
Sorry to prolong the discussion. Does it mean that after re-exposure, the board might amend the final pronouncement? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, that in taking that decision, there's a difference between where essentially the board has clarified concepts as a result of comments received from stakeholders about a lack of clarity in certain areas, and that's different from actually we have made a significant change to the standard, and therefore actually constituents need to be reconsulted. And then, as you say, we would go through the final process. And we've seen that in terms of the fact that we had 2 exposure drafts on leases, for example. So we exposed one approach, we didn't get support for that. Then we went to a clearly aligned approach on leases, and we issued a second exposure draft there. Sorry, Ross.
That's technically not right, Ian, and that wasn't a re-exposure. We didn't go through the process because at the exposure draft, it was clear that there was no final standard that was going to rise from ED 64. So the board revised its approach and decided to develop a different exposure draft. So I just want to make that clear because the re-exposure and due process is very clear. You have to approve a final standard first, and then there's a very high bar. 2/3 of the board will have to vote to re-expose, and will have to be clear on the basis for re-exposure on both documents in our minutes and highlight that in the exposure draft. And matter of fact, the board, as far as I can remember, has never re-exposed a final pronouncement in this manner before. We have altered the approach of a project and did a second ED, as Ian noted, but that's not re-exposure.
Does that help? I mean, it might help actually just, obviously when we do that paper, to actually make sure that board members have sight of that due process document, so that we see that alongside. Okay, Lynn.
Thanks, Ian. The papers imply re-exposure. Agenda item 6.2.2 suggests an SMC. So I guess my observation is if we delay our decision till when we've got the final standard, we might not be spotting what could be potential SMCs. So I guess my slight challenge, but I can live with what you're suggesting, which is we do delay. I guess my observation is if we knew now that we were heading towards a re-exposure, it might speed up the process of identifying SMCs.
Yeah, so I think we should wait for the paper, to be honest, because I think we should follow our due process as we set it out and very clearly. And I think this paper will set out that and I don't think when our memo is done and we explain where there's differences from the ED very clearly, I think that will help guide where you need SMCs. And again, I would expect on a re-exposure that you don't have a number of SMCs. You clearly highlight the differences from the original exposure draft and where the changes are, and that's your basis for re-exposure, and you ask for comments.
I mean, on the question of SMCs and so on, I think that's probably something where it would be quite useful because we've not done this before, as you pointed out, Ross, in exactly this way. I think it might be worthwhile just consulting with colleagues from audit and ethics who may well have been down this route. But I think it's probably better that we're talking about draft final standards rather than EDs. You know, for the reason that we have actually, I mean, I think, you know, staff have done a very thorough analysis job on the 200 responses we received across the 3 EDs to ensure that we have actually addressed all the constituent comments the first time round. So, you know, we'll look at the precedent from other boards if there is, and that's relevant to bring in. Okay. So we've got 10 minutes till we're due to break. It might actually be better if Leah tells us that coffee is ready. Is Leah? Yeah, okay. So my suggestion would be let's break for coffee at that stage. So then we come back at 10 to. And I know David has his bell with him today, so listen out for the bell. Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I think here we can see the problem of the board having not seen each other for so long. So bringing us back into the business of the day. If I can pass over then to, I think, Edwin, is this one you? Yep. Okay, so over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. So we're going to go through a few issues paper before the page flip of the transfer expenses draft IPSAS. So first, we're going to have 2 papers on disclosures, and then a short paper on capital transfers, and then a paper that is sort of a catch-all of the remaining substantive issues. And then the last paper is the page flip. So in this first paper, we're going to talk about presentation disclosures, and the way the staff has split them is this first paper deals with presentation disclosures for transfer expense related balances. So things like the assets and the liabilities that will be recorded in a transfer expense transaction. The next paper will deal with the expense line item itself in the statement of financial performance. So essentially what staff is recommending is that there isn't really a whole lot of need for specific presentation and disclosure requirements for transfer expense related items. And I'll go through the asset and the liability separately, but in terms of assets, IPSAS 1 already has some requirements for prepayment assets, which in effect is the same nature as a transfer right asset that we're talking about in transfer expenses. So we're proposing to require a transfer provider to essentially apply the presentation disclosure requirements over prepayment assets from IPSAS 1. And one thing that we also noted is that in some cases, your transfer right asset might be reclassified into a financial asset. And those situations arise in situations where, for example, there has been a breach and the transfer provider has the right under the binding arrangement to recover those funds. And we thought in those instances, we already have a lot of presentation and disclosure requirements on financial instruments. So we're proposing to signpost in the transfer expense standard to apply the financial instrument presentation disclosure requirements for those assets. And in addition, we noted that when we think about a transfer transaction, in a majority of cases, we're really thinking about the expense. So in situations where you have recognized or you will recognize a transfer right asset, that's really not the normal situation. So we're also proposing to require disclosure of the judgments that have been applied to explain transactions that resulted in the recognition of an asset. And in addition to that, so when we exposed ED 72, we did have a requirement for a roll forward of the transfer right asset balances. And a lot of constituents actually wrote back and said, well, that doesn't really provide a lot of good information and it's very onerous to do. But in light of the fact that we are deleting pretty much all the other disclosures for transfer expenses, we would also like to raise an SMC to ask, well, in light of the reduced disclosures, do you think it'll be helpful, in addition to explaining why you have an asset, to have this roll forward of your transfer right asset balances? So we're proposing those 3 things for assets, and I'll pause here before I go to liabilities.
Thanks, Edwin, for the introduction. So open up for comments from members. Yeah, Liang, lead us off, and then Claudia after that.
Thanks, Chair. I just have observation. We require to disclosure the reconcile of the opening and the closing balance of the transfer rights asset here. But my question is it necessary to have such requirement? Because as it is said the transfer right asset just similar, the nature just similar to a prepayment. Even for private sector, we have no disclosure requirement about prepayment. So I just wonder whether it is necessary for us to have such disclosure requirement to disclosure the movement. Thank you.
Thanks, Liang. Back to you, Edwin.
Yeah, so that is why we wanted to add in an SMC, because that's precisely the reasoning that we got from a lot of constituents. And I guess the only reason why we're proposing it now is because we have essentially removed all the other disclosures that were in ED 72. So right now, essentially, it's just really your reason for having an asset balance. And like, in addition to that, this is really just further explaining that asset balance.
I think maybe it is more relevant to disclose the closing balance, but the focus may not be the reconcile.
Thanks, Liang. So I think that might be one that's worth, from an accountability point of view, I think the idea was that the movement was important, and that perhaps goes to what have you, what's gone through as an expense in the year. So I think that was the rationale on that one. I mean, I'm not cited on what we've got in terms of the basis for conclusion, but I think that maybe there's some explanation required there. I don't know, Edwin, if you want to add on that.
Yeah, we can definitely explain in the BCs, like why we're requiring this.
Okay, so if you can work with Liang on that, that would be good. So next I'd got Claudia, and then I think Todd and Lynn after that.
So I have more or less the same point as Liang has. If you really need it, if it's a prepayment, we don't require for the disclosures. And then I remember to our discussion before the coffee break, I'm really struggling to have an SMC on this point. We could have a preliminary review that we want or we see that it's relevant, then it's fine. But in SMC, it's didn't fit to the idea where we have a final standard, we need to an approval and we have to approve. And when we approve, then it's probably the view of the board that we have required this additional disclosures.
So, I mean, I think really we're getting pushback on that disclosure. So, I mean, probably the question really is, as given what Liang has said in terms of, what's an IPSAS 1 and what Claudia's just said, do we see a difference here? I think that's the question. I just want some feedback from members on whether they see a difference and therefore the need for that disclosure or not. And then we'll carry on with other points. But if members just want to provide some feedback on the pushback that we're getting from two members. Lindy, are you in on this one? And then I'll go to Lynn and Scott.
Thank you. I support, I would probably want a lot more, but I support having the opening balance and a reconciliation at closing balance. Certainly where I sit in my jurisdiction, we are debating quite a bit on how do you hold an entity accountable for its transfers? You only see one line as the expense, and then you maybe see a balance on the balance sheet, and it's very difficult to then say, well, if you are an entity and a majority of your expenditure sits under transfers, how do we know that this performance has actually been done? How do we know what it actually entails? And I think that's where your financial or non-financial performance and your reporting against your strategy and objectives actually becomes quite important. But I think that we should definitely have the reconciliation. It's something we've also included in our set of financial statements. So I wouldn't take it out. I think it is quite significant in the public sector. A lot of programs are delivered through transfers, and I think we need that information. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. So Lynn, then Scott, and then to Lucy.
So I disagree with Lindy, and I agree with Liang on this. I don't think there's anything stopping organizations having greater disclosure. I don't think we should require it. I also think that we have in effect already got responses on this when we had the requirement for the reconciliation of binding arrangements, assets and liabilities. Yes, we're calling them something different now, but in paragraph 3B of the paper, we already know that our constituents felt the requirements were over complex and provided little value. So therefore, I don't support having this disclosure as a requirement.
Thanks, Lynn. Scott, to you, and then to Lucy. And then I think what I might do is just actually take a straw poll and see where members are, given that we've clearly got a number of different views around the board. Scott.
Yeah, I just wanted to join in endorse what Lynn and Lang said. Yeah, I think we ought to resist putting bookkeeping numbers in our footnotes and over disclose them, and agree with Lynn. We've already heard they don't think there's any value here. So I don't think asking them a second time is going to get us a different answer.
Thanks, Scott. Lucy, to you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree with the suggestions of Liang, Claudia, Lynn, and Scott's. That in my opinion, it may not be necessary to require entities to make the additional disclosure requirements mentioned under paragraph 8. As such, proposed additional disclosure requirements, although they may be viewed as useful to users, but they could be burdensome on the part of the entities. Instead, it may be mentioned that the entities are not required, but are highly encouraged to provide disclosures on such information, particularly if they are not otherwise separately presented or disclosed elsewhere in the financial statements. To confirm or refute the foregoing comment, I agree with the staff recommendation to include an SMC asking for feedback on whether the disclosure proposed in paragraph 2C would provide helpful information. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Renee, I'll take you, and then I'm going to just ask for a show of hands on who supports inclusion and who doesn't. Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I do support reducing the disclosure workload here. However, this is a new asset that we're introducing on the balance sheet under this new public sector approach. And what I was thinking on the expense side, the other place where the debit could end up eventually, is that we may want to consider disclosing our transfers by kind of transfers, by type of transfers, similar to how we disclose expense by type. So to Lindy's point, that would help bring more accountability in the types of transfers that an organization provides when there's high volume and from an accountability perspective and delivering significant programs. So maybe on the asset side, we don't require a reconciliation, but we could encourage to disclose the asset by type, similar to how we could do it on the expense side as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So, I mean, we've had sort of, if you like, three options, I think. One is don't require anything, one is require something, and one is an encouraged. I think those are the three options that I've heard from around the board table. And so I think what I want to do just at this stage is just actually ask for a show of hands around those three options, and we just see where board members actually are. So just for clarity, if we say the first option is to support staff, the second option is not to have anything, and the third is to have something in the middle. Can I just ask for a show of hands who would support the staff proposal? So I think we have 4 board members there, is that right? So through account. 4. Who would support, who doesn't want to have anything, any requirements in there? Okay, and who would support some sort of middle way in terms of okay. So I think that's where we end up with we won't make any requirements on that. Okay. But we'll come back to that point when we look at the expense, which is the next paper after this. So if I can take any further comments at this stage, Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I support the disclosure of a transfer right asset. There was just one caution in the way that we go about that, because we've sort of likened a transfer right asset to prepayments. If you look into IPSAS 1, they talk about prepayments in the context of receivables, and I don't think a transfer right asset is sort of seen in the same way in terms of receivables. So I think we're just going to have to be a little bit careful if we're going to refer into IPSAS 1 that we don't actually refer to the paragraph that sort of is around receivables, because transfer right assets aren't receivables. So just be careful in terms of if you're going to refer into IPSAS 1 that you refer into the right place.
Yeah, so in IPSAS 1, there is actually a place that talks about how it's separate from receivables. So that's the paragraph I was going to point to, but yes.
Lynn, you.
So I didn't know where to raise the point that I was going to raise, but I think here is as good as any. In the papers, it's paragraph 11 that it talks about in circumstances a reclassification of a transfer right to a financial asset. I didn't necessarily agree that it was a reclassification. I think sometimes you have a different asset if you've got somebody who's now not going to perform, and you might be entitled to some form of penalty or repayment. I didn't think that was a reclassification. And I guess the decision that we've just made about not requiring disclosure of the reconciliation made me think we probably ought to think about, are there other disclosures, for example, where you have impaired your transfer right that you would want disclosure, where for whatever reason it's not a normal expense of it, it is some form of write-off of the transfer right asset. So I guess there's a consequence of, if we're not going to require the reconciliation, are there elements of the movement that you would want differently disclosed?
Thanks, Lynn. So, I mean, kind of it's more by way of recharacterization, isn't it, rather than reclassification? Because it's an active decision and you need to reassess. Is that what you're saying?
So I think there could be, and I don't think we're crisp enough in the drafting when we come to do the page turn on this, about when is it you've got a new event and a different asset, and when is it you've got so the papers just assume this reclassification in the event that somebody's now not able to perform, but what I guess it doesn't rehearse, when is it you've got a new event and a new assessment of asset and liability, a trigger event. It just assumes this reclassification. There could be circumstances of reclassification, but equally there could be new event and new asset. So I think that needs to be looked at. But putting that to one side, having made the decision we've just made about non-disclosure, I think we ought to also debate, are there movements in the transfer right asset that you would want disclosed?
Edwin, back to you on that, and then I'll go to Lindy.
Yeah, so the draft IPSAS now talks about an impairment of a right if you don't have the reclassification. And I guess the way that it's worded now only talks about recognition and measurement, and it just says use the impairment standard for non-cash generating assets. So I'm thinking maybe we should expand that and say it's really look at the accounting and the disclosure requirements from the impairment standard as well, which would cover it.
Okay, so I think there's an instruction there just to sort of have a look at that. Lindy.
Yes, I do think it's not a reclassification because it's an event that leads to the recognition of a financial asset. So you'd have to de-recognize the one and recognize the other. So I think maybe we must just make that clear.
So Edwin, I think if you can work with Lynn and Lindy on that to get that right. Okay, thanks on that. So I think with that, any other comments from members on that particular item before we move on to the expense side? Okay, that's good. So move us on then, Edwin.
Okay, so the next paper talks about the transfer expense itself in the statement of financial performance. And again, essentially, the staff is recommending that we don't have anything specific, and we just refer to IPSAS 1. And this was because when we exposed ED 72, the majority of respondents actually said this is going way too overboard. And in the discussion of the nature of the entity and its operations, a lot of disclosures already deal with the expenses and also transfer expenses of the operations of the entity. So what we mean by referring to IPSAS 1 is that there are actually specific requirements for expenses. So paragraph 109 requires an analysis of expense by either nature or function. Paragraph 111 actually talks about the need to highlight costs and recoveries of programs, activities, and segments of the entity. And paragraph 115 essentially says that if you have done the analysis by function, you have to provide specific disclosures on the nature of certain expenses. So the plan for staff is to essentially say in the transfer expense standard that we should be talking about your transfer expenses in the context of those three requirements in IPSAS 1. So I'll pause here for comments.
Thanks, Edwin. Renee, you raised your flag. I was going to go straight back to you anyway. So great minds.
Thank you, Chair. So I think that back to my point, considering to explicitly interpret what the first line means, analysis of expense by nature in a case of transfer, to clarify that we would be expecting transfer by type, because one could interpret this as just meaning, okay, I just have one line, transfer. And I think as a government that gets into significant transfers, I think it would be in the public interest actually to be able to itemize based on your significant programs. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I guess, Linda, you're in on this one as well, before I go back to staff.
I don't agree, but so my concern is if you classify on the face of the statement of financial performance transfers by nature, the nature is it's a transfer. And so it's one line, and maybe you can say capital transfers or current transfers. I acknowledge I don't think this project can solve it, and potentially it should be flagged when we look at the presentation project, and maybe we need to think about in the public sector. I don't know, maybe even by function is actually more relevant or useful in the place, but I think maybe it's something that should be dealt with there instead of trying to deal with it here. So.
Edwin, responding to the two comments we received there. Oh, sorry, Camilla, are you in on this as well? Okay, then I'll go to Edwin.
Yes, thanks. Sure. I think in addition to the disclosures that the staff is proposing, we could also include something on which transfer expenses were arising from binding arrangements and which not. So I think that would also be useful from the perspective of the users, because they can identify whether an entity is only transferring without enforcing anything or without any binding arrangement or a present obligation, whereas another entity is perhaps paying more attention on how the transferred resources are being used. Thanks.
Thanks, Camilla. So Edwin, back to you.
So when I originally wrote the paper, I was thinking that the paragraph 111, the one that talks about specific programs and activities, would give the level of detail in more than just one line saying transfer expenses. So maybe I can work with Renee and Lindy and on how to actually be more explicit about that. And then on the binding arrangement versus non-binding arrangements, I haven't thought about that because the original disclosure in 72 was whether something had a performance obligation, and the overwhelming response was the difference doesn't really matter. So that's why we didn't consider that again, but I can think about whether something would be warranted to separate the two buckets of expenses.
I mean, I think, we've got to be mindful about disclosure, unnecessary disclosures or mandating disclosures that might be of interest to some people, but not to everyone. And I think that's where we need to pay attention to what was the nature of the comments we received back last time. Equally, I think there is a balance which Renee's expressed, and with transfer expenses, it's quite likely that for many governments these will be significant, and so therefore, I think as you've suggested, Edwin, I think if you can work on that, because I think we need to give them some form of lead that these are where these are significant, then actually you need to think about the different potentially different streams and so on, which may indirectly address Camira's point rather than explicitly. But I think, it comes back to overall, what are we trying to draw attention to in the financial statements to ensure accountability? So if you can take it forward in that way. Thanks, everyone. I think useful discussion. Any other points on that? We're clear on that one before we move on. Lynn.
So mine sort of links to the next paper on capital transfers, and I was going to.
Okay, well, if we just move on.
But it is a presentation and disclosure point.
Okay, well, if we could just introduce the capital transfer,
yeah,
and
I
then
could say, did you want it here or did you want it there? I wasn't quite sure where.
Let's do it there, and then we're okay. So Edwin, just introduce, and then we'll go to Lynn first.
Okay, so in terms of capital transfers, staff thought about this from the perspective of the transfer provider this time. So essentially the way we thought about it was we thought about what potential scenarios could arise from a capital transfer. So from a transfer provider's perspective, you could either have you could be giving resources to a transfer recipient who will then either buy a non-financial asset, like a capital asset, or construct their own non-financial asset. And in terms of the outcomes, so you could have a situation where the recipient is buying the non-financial asset. And in that case, you could just apply the revised transfer expense model, and you would essentially set up a transfer right asset upon the transfer and then expense it when this non-financial asset is purchased by the recipient. Or if the recipient is constructing the asset, you would set up the transfer right asset upon transfer, and then you would expense the transfer expense as or when the construction is occurring. And then you could also have a third situation where if the transfer recipient buys or constructs the asset before the transfer actually happens, then the model would tell you to record a transfer expense and a liability. So we know that in all those three scenarios, the general revised transfer expense model already addresses these issues. So we're proposing that similar to the revenue side, we're proposing no additional authoritative guidance needs to be developed for capital transfers. And our plan is to clarify in the application guidance how the general principles will apply to capital transfers. And I guess before I open it up, so we actually received comments from a national standard setter, and they were
they had two comments. The first one was it was unclear whether a binding arrangement is always required for a capital transfer. And this issue was brought up, I think, back in June when we looked at this from the revenue perspective. And back then our conclusion was, well, yes, it is required. And that is how we've defined capital transfer. And the same constituent actually asked, is the transfer of a capital asset a capital transfer? And the way we've looked at capital transfers in the EDs and in the revised standards is we're really looking at what the recipient has to do with this resource to determine whether it's capital or operating. So if you receive, for example, a building and you're required to operate in the building, then that's actually an operating transfer and it's not a capital transfer as we've defined it. So I think this approach is more similar to how it's done under statistical accounting. So that's how we define capital transfers back in the ED, and we've carried that forward now. So
thanks, Edward. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, so often when you are a capital transfer provider, i.e. you're giving the capital grant, or in simplistic terms, you often then protect your rights. If the entity doesn't use the asset, then you quite often have a protective right. And that's a contingent asset, quite rightly not reflected as an asset in the balance sheet. But I did question in my mind about disclosure there, and were we clear enough about how you've protected your rights when you've done a capital transfer to have the recipient continue to use the asset? And I thought some disclosure around that might be helpful.
Edwin?
yeah, we can definitely add that in. I think it'll be useful as well.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether it was Renee or Lindy. Okay, Lindy, you go first, and then Renee, and then Mike.
Thank you. We've established an infrastructure fund where we give grants for construction of infrastructure assets. So I thought perhaps we can think about including some example on that. I think it's quite common in a lot of public sector jurisdictions to set up stuff like that. So it might be useful as an example to include. We can have a discussion on stuff.
Okay, Renee, then Mike, then over Adrian.
Yes, thank you. I keep reflecting on the transfer of a physical asset as opposed to cash. So from the recipient's perspective, they're receiving an asset that has to be recorded, that has to be recognized. So that takes me to the PP&E standard. It's a non-exchange transaction. It doesn't have commercial substance when two governments. Here it would have to be like a government transferring or public sector transferring to another public sector entity. And in PP&E, we go straight to the carrying amount if there's no commercial substance. It goes back to a point I made earlier this morning in the other session, wondering if as a recipient of a capital transfer in the form of a physical asset, should I be asking myself, what am I going to use it for going forward? Am I going to use it for operational capacity or not? The definition of capital transfers refer to the transfer of a physical asset to the recipient. So it's there, but it's referring to it as with a specification, right? Of using the transfer, usually it's cash, to construct or acquire. So here, it seems like the definition is not consistent with itself because there's no specification coming with the asset other than to operate it, but you have to set it up as a recipient in your books. And I feel there may be a gap here in the guidance overall when I step back.
Thanks, Renee. And I think it's good that you're looking at it from both ends, actually. Eileen, you put your flag up first. So if you want to go first.
Respond first if you like. Okay, but thanks for your point, Renee. And after having talked about it separately as well, it kind of made me think a bit further. Now, in terms of the definition of a capital transfer, I think the way it was written in the EDs and that we've brought in for this current draft IPSAS was intended to really reflect on when you do use that asset to then acquire, construct something else. Now, I think in the example you referred to where you receive a capital asset as the transfer, I don't think it's intended to fit the definition as is, but it is still a transfer of capital, but it would actually fall under the non-cash consideration that we're thinking of within the current revenue IPSAS as we have it drafted. Now, I know you noted there too, it makes you think of PP&E, but the drafting we have right now in the draft revenue IPSAS talks about recognizing it at fair value. So it is something I've made a note of to just take that away and think on it further, because you could be using it for operating capacity or financial capacity, and therefore fair value may actually not be appropriate for those cases. So I would say all in all, I don't think we have a gap, but I think it's about being clearer when you have a transfer of a physical asset. No, it doesn't meet the definition of a capital transfer as we've defined it, but here's the guidance that you would need to consider, and also to reflect on that measurement basis of fair value or potentially COV, depending on whether it's an operating or financial capacity. So I will take this away, and Edwin and I will look at that further, and we'll get back to you on how we want to address that.
Thanks. Ross, did you want to come in before I go back to Renee on this?
Yeah, and just to state the obvious here, that that's not a gap in our literature right now when you're talking about real assets that are given through a non-exchange transaction. IPSAS 17 deals with that, as does inventory. And that's why we've got the paragraph that recognizes them initially at fair value, because you're not giving any consideration up. So on initial measurement, that's not a gap at the moment in the literature. That's been applied in the standards for many years. The gap has always been on the transfer of resources to be used to purchase a capital asset. That's why the specific definition is the way it is.
Thanks, Ross. So it does sound like, I think in considering this, that certainly there's a communication issue here, and probably that's, there's two parts. This one is just to double check that we are, we've got the guidance, and the second is actually, to address the point that Renee made, because I think if that's risen as a question for her, then clearly it's something that we need to clarify for our constituents wherever it's most appropriate on that. Renee, back on that.
Yes, I just want to clarify. So when I read the definition, it says that the transfer of a capital transfer, it's transfer of cash or another asset. So that's what's triggering the question in my mind. But Eileen, as you just explained it, I'm not sure that in your explanation, there's room for transfer of a physical asset. It's transfer of a resource that is then going to be used. So that in my mind feels and look like cash. So I don't, if that's the intention, then I'm actually questioning whether we have the definition right. That's another point. Thank you.
Okay, I think if staff can take that away, I mean, it does feel to me in the way that you've expressed it, that there may actually be a possible piece of implementation guidance here that might actually just clarify that, because it feels like a kind of question that, if we have that instruction to staff, and what's the most appropriate way to address this? If we have an inconsistency, firstly, do we have an inconsistency? And secondly, how do we just address the communication point and the question that's arisen? Mike, to you, and then to Adrian.
So thank you, Chair. I have a comment on the transfer obligation liabilities. In practice, we observe very often that we have multi-year arrangements or arrangements which are partially fulfilled at the end. Therefore, I would like to change the wording in the ED a little bit to make sure that the liability arises also when the recipient has started to fulfill its obligation. Yeah. The current wording is fulfills the obligation, but if you say fulfills or has started to fulfill, it's a little bit more made more clear that we don't require 100% completion for, let's say, accounting with a liability.
Thanks, Mike. I think that point's taken. Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. I want to be seen as a monomaniac, but again, it's a matter of principle that I want to comment on. Specifically, I think I could not concur with the Lynn's comment on transfer of a physical asset and the contingent liability that arises in the provider. We already have, guidance on disclosures referring to contingent liabilities of contingent assets as well. So I think that in principle, if we add to existing guidances, we create confusion in the mind of readers, preparers, because they sometimes would believe that it is an additional guidance where it is not, and they are not, tempted to go back to the basic principles or to the basic guidance that sit in other IPSASs. We are very keen on consistency between IPSASs, but we also should be very focused on the fact that no IPSAS adds or seems to add additional guidances to existing guidances. This is something I'm very, very focused on.
Thanks, Adrian. So I think what we're really looking for is a cross-reference here, isn't it? So that it reminds people to apply that guidance. And I think then that bridges between those two positions. Okay, Mike, are you still in or? Okay. So I think we're there then. Adrian, you're okay. Good. Okay.
So the next paper is looking at 4 remaining substantive issues. And the first one is we actually added a few definitions into the draft IPSAS, and specifically transfer consideration and standalone consideration. Now, the only reason why we added these is because in the revenue standard, they use the terms transaction price and standalone value. And the way that those terms are defined are very specific to the resource or the transfer recipient or the seller. So we thought that if we're using the same term, it would cause confusion because now we're looking at it from the transfer provider's perspective. So we've introduced the term transfer consideration and standalone consideration so that they can be standalone concepts.
Could we just do step by step? I just want to make sure we're okay with the those definitions. Not seeing any flags raised. Camira.
Thanks, Chair. This is a question for the staff. Do we really think that we need a new term? Perhaps we can just revise the definition so that it's more comprehensive and from both sides, so that we do not need to struggle with so many terms in the standard. Thanks.
Edwin, do you want to go back on that? It's a
Yes.
reasonable challenge.
So we decided to add the new terms because when we get to allocation of the consideration to the standalone, value, we do have a slightly different way of doing it from revenue. So that's why we needed a different term for that. But that's actually the third box on the slide. So we'll get to that in a bit.
Okay. I think the fact that Camira's raised that point, I'm not sure. Have you got this explained in basis for conclusions? Because I think if we are using an additional term, just actually making sure that we're clear about the reasoning for that would at least address the point that Camira's made of, just demonstrating we do actually need it and the reason why. Oh, Renee, sorry.
So I just want to point out another layer of complexity to my original comment, and it relates to this definition. I find definition kind of circular because it's just referring to a consideration for a consideration. And again, if I go back to the definition of a capital transfer, my consideration is not just an amount of cash. It could be a physical asset currently. So I'm just adding it's adding to another layer of complexity to my original comment. And I just wanted to point this out, that I think it's related to this term as well.
Okay, go to Lindy and then I'll go back to you, Edmund.
Yeah, I was just looking at the definition, thinking of Renee's earlier comment, and I wonder if amounts is appropriate. So maybe it should be resources or something like that in both definitions.
Okay, so I think there's a bit of work to do there just to land on the term based on the discussion that we just had in the definition, and then to articulate in a basis for conclusions the reasoning behind that. So I think that's, if you can do that, just working with Lindy, Renee and Camira, just to square that one off, please. Okay, so move us on.
Okay, so the next issue we looked at was variable consideration. And originally in ED 72, the guidance essentially was mirroring the revenue guidance for variable consideration, which is quite onerous. And also the only reason why there was separate guidance on variable consideration was because there was nothing in existing IPSAS that deals with essentially what is a contingent asset. So we thought that from a transfer provider's perspective, anytime you have variable consideration, it really is just the liability of uncertain timing and amount, which is essentially a provision in IPSAS 19. So staff is recommending to essentially delete all the previous guidance on variable consideration and just refer to the measurement guidance in IPSAS 19 for provisions if it is more likely than not that the transfer provider will be transferring variable consideration.
Open up for comments from members. Not seeing any flags, so I think we're content with that.
Okay. Okay, so the third issue is allocation of allocation of the resources that were transferred to individual transfer rights. So, and this goes back to the definitions that we've added. And what we are essentially saying is that we're proposing to, we're proposing to simplify the requirements from ED 72, which again, we're mirroring the revenue standard. But now we're just saying that the amounts or the amount that you're allocating to each transfer right should really be based on the amounts that are either stated in the binding arrangement or considered by the transfer provider when negotiating the binding arrangement. And so what we were trying to get at is that as the transfer provider, you'll know exactly how much you're willing to pay to have the transfer recipient perform whatever they're required to do. So unlike revenue, where there could be a lot of things going into this, such as like financing and all that, we boil it down to just think about what are you willing to compensate to have this other entity perform for you. And one thing that we thought about was, well, is this really oversimplifying it? And we thought from the revenue perspective, other than impacting the timing of revenue recognition, you could also have situations where when you have multiple deliverables, you could be masking different margins in the deliverables. And sometimes that would actually change in whether you have an upfront loss that is recognized. For transfer expenses, you don't really have any of those issues because everything eventually gets expensed anyway. So therefore, we thought this would be a much easier approach to implement, and that's what we settled on.
Thanks, Evan. Open up for comments from members. I think we're content with the recommendation there. Lindy.
I agree with the recommendation. Just something that we were discussing when we were looking at this. I don't know if we ever need to consider the time value of money for these type of transfer rights. I don't know if maybe in certain jurisdictions you pay a lot upfront over in a long period of time, but maybe that's something we can ask members of the drafting group or just consider things.
Edwin, on that?
So well, as staff, we thought about it, and
as you said, in most cases, you would have an upfront payment. So from the provider's perspective, like, I think whether you expense it now when you pay upfront or expense some form of interest, it wouldn't really, most of the time, it wouldn't be material because these aren't really long-term arrangements. So I can ask the drafting group if maybe they have examples of long-term arrangements, because
I mean, it sounds like one of these things that maybe, but do we really need to, you know, I would say let's not overcomplicate at this stage on that. For the reasons that Edwin explained. Eileen?
The only thing I would add just on the practical side is we have talked to a few other constituents just through the overall process about multi-year arrangements, transfers, et cetera. And it does sound like in practice, even if there are these long-term arrangements, multiple years, funding would rarely happen in year one and then nothing at all for, say, the remaining 5 years. It tends to still be on an annual basis. And part of the reason is in these binding arrangements, they want to make sure they can still continue to enforce that the recipients doing what they're expected to do. And so there's a kind of recurring process. So on a practical perspective, I think as Edwin mentioned, it's probably immaterial given it's just a 1-year situation.
Okay. No other points, so we move on.
okay, so the last substantive issue we looked at was transition. So this came up from ED 72, where essentially all the respondents said our transitional provisions were too complex. And we've also discussed this with the drafting group, where members indicated that we seem to be asking constituents to do a lot for very little value. So what staff has proposed is to allow retrospective application if constituents want to, but also allow prospective application of the standard. And right now, there's only a few paragraphs in the draft IPSASB because we wanted to get the board's decision on this first before drafting the details. But what we're envisioning is that to have constituents apply this draft standard for actual transfers occurring after the date of adoption. So essentially, you would just leave the accounting for stuff that happened before adoption and wind it down as you have been doing. And then just for any new transfers that have occurred after the adoption date, you would be applying the standard. So that's what we're proposing.
Thanks, Edwin. Take views from around the board on that. Any opening comments? And I might just ask for a show of hands actually, just to find out where people are on that. Lucy, and then I think Mike, and then Todd.
I agree actually, but however, I suggest the inclusion in the ongoing drafting of basis of conclusions, the rationale for the IPSASB's provision of an option for prospective application and transfers arising from transaction with or without binding arrangements occurring on or after the date of initial application of the policy, as this is a change in accounting policy that should be generally applied retrospectively in accordance with IPSAS 3. So it must be clear to the users, preparers, why we're giving an option for prospective application. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So go to Mike, then Todd, then Lindy.
So thank you. I've got an additional remaining substantive issue. So maybe first Linda and Todd, and after that I would.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We'll come back to you then. Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. I'm supportive of the simplified transitional provisions. I think that's helpful. Just reflecting though in terms of where it sits in relation to revenue, perhaps we will need to just think about that. And if we end up with much more complicated transitional provisions in revenue than we're going to have here, it would be good to be able to explain why we've landed with simplified here versus more complicated in revenue.
Thanks, Todd. So I'll go to Lindy and then perhaps back to staff just on that specific point of consistency. Lindy.
Thanks. I had the same comment as Todd. The other comment, I agree with what we're proposing. I just thought perhaps we can also acknowledge that you could have jurisdictions where you would have expensed it, but when you adopt it, you midway into that, and there could be significant unperformed obligations, and allow you on that day to recognize the remainder of your transfer right. So not to go back, but just start from that point going forward.
Thanks, Lindy. So consistency then with revenue. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can, well, yeah, I think the decision is that the board is agreeing on perspective, so I can work with Eileen to come up with something for revenue as well.
Well, I was going to just take a show of hands to check that we were okay on perspective. But if we assume that, well, if we went for perspective, then how would that work then with revenue?
So on revenue right now, it is retrospective, but it is something that we've noted to kind of take offline and just look at if there is a difference. Are we still able to justify it? Because the retrospective application is basically from previous decisions to do it retrospectively. I think one of the key themes that has come out through a lot of our revenue and transfer expense discussions is transfer expenses is simpler in some instances, whereas with revenue, there is a lot of transactions where you could have unfulfilled or partially unfulfilled compliance obligations, et cetera, which does add a level of complexity there. So I think it is useful for us to take offline and consider that further. And we'll definitely connect with you, Todd and Lindy, just to make sure that we kind of work through it together and get the right points.
Okay, so Lynn, you want to come in, and then I want to take a show of hands just in terms of do members support prospective or allowing prospective?
Sorry, it was just that point of clarification, because I supported the recommendation in the paper, which was to allow either. So I was just questioning a show of hands on one or the other, because I thought the paper was recommending either, and I was supportive of either.
Well, I think the point is, are we content to allow prospective, or are we saying no, it's change in accounting policy, therefore? So that's, sorry, to short-handed it, but so okay, so just to be clear, can I have a show of hands for members who would support either prospective or IPSAS 3 versus only IPSAS 3 approach? That's clear. So firstly, those members supporting allowing prospective as well as IPSAS 3 approach. Okay, and for the record, any that just IPSAS 3. So that's Lucy. Right. Okay. I mean, I think that's conclusive that we do support that choice. And therefore, yes, if you can advise us on consistency or reasons for a difference. Okay. Mike, to you then.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I remember the meeting in June where we discussed also constructive obligations. And there we had this situation that those constructive obligations are reflected in the financial statements, and they might become later on binding arrangement, which are not reflected in the FS as long as they are wholly unfulfilled. And so, as I think those situations, they are not unlikely, it might be good at an appropriate position of the standard to provide some guidance on the accountment treatment.
Edwin, thoughts on Mike's point?
So right now we do talk about constructive obligations, and it's more in the non-BA section of the standard. And we were actually looking at IPSAS 19, and there doesn't seem to be situations where you would start off with a constructive obligation and then essentially lead into a binding arrangement. Like that doesn't seem to be contemplated by 19. So that's why we didn't look into that in detail. But right now, the standard is just really referring to IPSAS 19 because we didn't want to rewrite anything that's already there.
You okay with that, Mike? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So move us on to the final.
Okay, so the last paper is essentially a page flip of the draft IPSAS. But before we do that, I just wanted to point out that staff did look at all the comments we received from the hundreds of comment letters. And essentially, we've made sure that all the issues have been addressed. So we've put together a table of the residual issues in 6.2.6. And as you can see, everything has been either addressed in the drafting or in one of the issue papers that we have discussed. So I'll just pause there before we go into the page flip.
Okay, so are there any concerns that members want to raise on that paper before we go into the page turn? Okay, so I think that's fine. So then what we're going to do is we'll move into the page by page review. And what I've asked Ross is if Ross will read the page numbers out in terms of moving us forward, because that's easier in terms of me then watching for flags going up. And it also means that Edwin can then capture comments as we go along. So Ross, if you want to lead us through.
So in your PDF paper pack, we're looking at 6.3.1 that starts on page 48 of the 153 page PDF with the table of contents. Sorry, I'm just getting to my spot on the page.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, so page 1 is the TOCs. I'm assuming we'll look at these again. So page 2 is the continuation of the TOCs, table of contents. Page 3 is where the standard starts.
Renee.
Yes, thank you. Paragraph 3 scope. It seems that the last sentence is an example of a scope out. So maybe we just reclassify it in the list below in paragraph 4.
Edwin.
Yeah, that was really kind of explaining the definition of what a transfer expense is, but I get your point, and I think we can work that into paragraph 4, so it's more of a specific example.
Okay, thanks. Todd?
Thanks, Ian. I did struggle a little bit with the objective and the use near the end of that paragraph of the term expenditure. So normally we talk about the nature, amount, timing, and uncertainty of cash flows, and we've added in here expenditure and cash flows, and I'm not sure that expenditure is actually needed in that case. So interested in whether that should come out.
Edwin?
Yeah, good point. I can remove that. So an expenditure is really just a cash outflow. So yeah.
And then I did have one other comment, and it relates to paragraph 4, we say that the standard doesn't apply to operating leases. I agree it doesn't apply to operating leases, but given that operating leases only affects lessors under our literature, it wouldn't actually apply in this particular situation. So it seems a bit redundant to even mention it, but I suppose there's no harm, but it just feels redundant.
Perhaps we leave that one with you, Edwin, to consider. Renee, are you still in or no? Okay. Right, okay, I think that's all the comments on that page, so move us on.
Page 4. Continuation of paragraph 5 and the definitions.
Todd. Oh, and then Mike.
Just looking at the definitions. So if you go down, I think you've got 5 definitions, and then you've got a paragraph that starts, an entity is an entity that provides goods, services, etc. It felt like there was something missing. Are we talking about a transfer provider as an entity that provides a good service or other asset? Just looked like something had gone wrong there.
Yeah, it should have said a transfer provider is an entity that provides goods.
Thanks, Todd. Mike, to you, and then to Renee.
Yeah, my comment goes direct in the direction of Todd's one. I'm also not very happy with that entity definition, because I think we might consider here to use a transfer provider to make it clear throughout the standard, and it's even becoming more complicated if you look in the standard, for example, in AJ 2027, where the transfer provider is called purchaser and the entity the transfer recipient. And so I think in that context, why not using transfer provider or transfer recipient throughout the entire standard?
So then we had decided on which term we were going to
Yeah.
standardize on. So it's a consistency point then.
So we originally used transfer provider everywhere, but I think keeping with the style of other IPSAS, we do use entity for the reporting entity. So that's why we talked about transfer provider up front and then had brackets entity. So I can have a look at the AG paragraphs to make sure that everything uses entity and is consistent.
Ross. Okay, fine. Thanks for that, Mike. Renee, to you.
Yes, beginning of paragraph 7, when we refer to the definitions in a revenue standard, could we just add in the introductory sentence from the transfer provider's perspective?
Okay, have a look at that. Sort of belts and braces, but use the colloquial term. Okay. So we move on.
So page 5.
Lynn.
Yeah, mine is on paragraph 8, which the paragraph comes under the heading of identifying the transfer expense transaction, but it then immediately talks about how you account for the transaction rather than how you identify the transaction. And the paragraph in its entirety doesn't even have the word expense in it. This is kind of like the first bit of bold authoritative text we have, and it feels odd not to have the word expense in it. And I'm not sure it's quite achieving what the heading is saying either. So I think this paragraph does need a bit of work.
Thanks then. Okay, any other points? Okay, good. Move us on.
Page 6.
I think we're fine with that. Move on.
Page 7.
Renee, you still got your mic on. Okay. No comments on page 7.
Page 8.
Yeah, Lynn.
Yeah, so paragraph 29, we need to look at in the light of the discussion earlier on about reclassification.
Thanks, noted. Move on.
Page 9.
That's fine.
Page 10.
Yeah, Lynn.
Same comment on para 43 about reclassification.
Thanks. Okay, next page.
Page 10.
No comments.
Page 11, which brings us to the end of the authoritative, the text.
Okay, fine with that.
Page 11, start of application guidance.
No, we're fine with that.
Page 12.
Okay,
Page 13.
no flags up on that.
Page 14.
Fine on that.
Page 15.
We're fine with that.
Page 16.
Yeah, Lindy.
Thank you. It's in the diagram. The last sentence, the bottom of the diagram should be right to promised obligations and not consideration. The same as in the revenue one.
Eileen, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, Lindy and I actually discussed this yesterday as well. And so we're going to revisit the diagram. And I think the change to obligation would be appropriate for both standards. So Edwin and I will take that away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Page 17.
Todd.
Thanks, Ian. Mine's on the diagram as well. And I just paused when I got to sort of the bottom of that diagram, and it referred quite specifically to vaccines. And I think now that we're putting this in the standard in a more general way, I wonder whether it should just refer to health services rather than get into something as specific as vaccines. It was probably done that way in conjunction with an example and previously, and I think we're lifting it up. So just to refer to health services rather than vaccines.
Thanks, Todd. No other comments?
18.
Oh, Adrienne.
Sorry, I had a comment on the diagram, page 17. I don't recognize the state government terminology. We could say local government, because a state doesn't exist in every country. I mean, under the national government. State government is for the US, I would say.
It's probably just how it's actually sort of described and used, but if staff can just clear that with you. Eileen?
I think it came in when the ED 70, 71, 72 were initially built in, but we could probably change that to regional, and that helps to clarify kind of national, regional, and a bit more generic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the two comments, aren't there? There's Todd's comment about raises it up, but I think there's also Adrienne's comment about context. So we just make it more clearly applicable in a variety of situations. Lindy.
Very much. Sorry, and it's also on 16 and 17. I think this comes from what we previously had, and we bring in here about the third party beneficiaries. I don't think we really have it in the core of the standard anymore. So maybe we just need to look at the look at the
Eileen?
wording and make sure it's consistent in the expenditure stand.
Yes, so I know on the revenue side, that was definitely something we moved to talk about parties in an arrangement within the AGs. It might be a matter of where we have the flow, so what comes first, and we don't use any terms that we don't explain until later on. So I think on a consistency perspective, Edwin and I will just make sure that that flow does make sense. And if we really do need to make a reference down just for the logic of the flow of the guidance, then we'll make sure to do that. But thanks for the note.
Okay, thanks. So I think we're back on 18.
Yeah, 18.
Yeah, Renee.
AG 38 feels authoritative. There's a shall in there, and it's quite a significant piece of guidance. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be better placed up in the core standard.
Ross.
We can have a look at that and whether it should be placed up, but AGs are also authoritative. So core text AGs are authoritative part of the standard, non-authoritative starts, BCs, IGs, IEs.
Okay, yeah, if you can take a look at that with Renee, that'd be good. Thanks. Okay, no other comments on 18, so
19.
Are we good on that?
20.
Lynn.
Yeah, my comment is on AG 51. It's very definitive, and I'm not sure I absolutely agree with it, because I do think often in capital transfers, you do still have rights in terms of the obligation for the person to continue to use it. You may not put a value with that. It may be contingent on a default, but I don't think as drafted, I don't agree with AG 51.
Okay, thanks then. So staff can work with Lynn on that to improve the drafting. Thanks.
21. Actually, that's it.
Okay, I think we're through. So thanks everyone for those comments. I think you know, that's the first time we've actually seen the authoritative text for the standard, but I think that showed very clearly how it's a much simpler, cleaner document. And I think thanks to staff in terms of the way they've worked through constituent comments, and also thanks to the drafting group in terms of the time put into reviewing. I think it's looking good. Obviously, fair way still to go, but I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. So thanks for that. Okay, so Eileen, I think over to you on compelled transactions.
Thank you, Chair. So we'll be pivoting the session now to talk about the revenue project specifically. Now, the board had previously discussed revenue disclosures as a whole in June 2022, so at the last meeting, and had at that time decided to retain all of the revenue disclosures that were previously required in 80, 70, and 71, based on the key purpose of disclosures that we have outlined in our conceptual framework, and also the overall approach to remain principle-based. And therefore, that meant that disclosures that we would require would need to be aligned with the principles that we have in the revenue accounting models. Now, for completeness purposes, this paper is really just intended to review the final 8070 specific matter for comment, specifically SMC 5, where respondents were asked to provide feedback on a specific public sector disclosure that the board decided to add. And this is now going to be reviewed in the context of the board's decisions from June. Now, ED70 basically proposed to add a public sector specific disclosure requirement on compelled transactions, where an entity is compelled to enter into a transaction legislation or other government policy decisions, and the parties that are receiving the goods and services as a result of that transaction do not have the ability or the intention to pay. Now, overall, from the 200 some odd responses that we received, a significant minority of respondents actually did not respond to the SMC or noted that this type of transaction is not prevalent in their specific jurisdiction. However, it's clear from the responses that we did receive on this SMC that the proposed disclosure was strongly supported, and none of the respondents disagreed with adding this public sector specific disclosure. Now, this agreement is based on 3 key points. So the first is that it really captures a unique public sector transaction that may be material and prevalent in certain jurisdictions. It supports accountability and transparency, and it provides useful information for financial statement users. Now, we looked at the comments from constituents that partially agreed and what they noted in addition as part of their response. And we kind of categorized it based on 3 key asks: whether to enhance or revise the disclosure, to provide additional guidance to support the application, or to consider some of the practical implications of requiring this disclosure. Now, staff's analysis is presented in Appendix 1 of this paper. And overall, what staff recommends is that this disclosure requirement is actually retained within the now draft revenue IPSAS without any further changes. And this is primarily because of, 1, being guided by the IPSASB's decision and direction with how we want to handle disclosures and revenue that we decided in June, but also the fact that we have overwhelming support from respondents on this disclosure. This is because this disclosure really does provide the transparency and accountability, which is a very key perspective and intention behind disclosures, and that this disclosure would provide very useful information for financial statement users. Now, this disclosure itself is currently paragraph 172 in the draft revenue IPSAS, which is presented in agenda item 6.3.2, and it combines what we had in 7071 to avoid duplication and any repetition, and therefore make the guidance easier to understand and apply. So with that, I'm happy to pass it back to the chair to collect comments from members about any disagreements with the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen, for that analysis on this. So does anybody disagree that we proceed as supported by constituents? Okay, thank you. I think we're good with that. So move us on to the IG.
Thank you, Chair. So the final issue paper that we have for agenda item 6 is related to proposed implementation guidance topics. Now, as mentioned at the beginning of the session, the IPSASB has been focusing on identifying and refining the accounting principles for both revenue as well as for transfer expenses accounting respectively, with the intention of revisiting non-authoritative guidance once the authoritative guidance, which presents accounting principles, has been finalized. Now, given the IPSASB's progress to date, staff began considering where certain topics could be added as IGs that would be useful for constituents to consider and have available in support of the authoritative text that has been created to date. Now, because there are certain principles and concepts that are consistent between the 2 projects, staff conducted this analysis concurrently to make sure that we are consistent with the non-authoritative guidance that would accompany the consistent principles. And so this list of proposed IG topics was also proposed to the drafting group in August to collect some preliminary feedback and did receive general support from the drafting group members. Now, the one thing to note before I start going through the list is that in past projects, the format that we had for authoritative and non-authoritative types of guidance was that for IG specifically, IGs would consider common implementation challenges that are widespread amongst public sector entities and would use a Q&A format to better be able to communicate some of the considerations with these principles. And so staff considered the principles and concepts that were presented in the authoritative text and essentially identified which topics would benefit from having additional IGs in this Q&A format that would support the principles that we are already presenting in the authoritative text for one or more of the reasons that are listed in the paper. Now, these reasons are: one, the concept is complex and potentially difficult to apply in practice. Two, it's an area of concern for constituents. And three, staff and or board members have already previously noted from past discussions and decisions on accounting principles that additional non-authoritative guidance would be useful here. And so we'll go through the list of topics on the slide here, not in too much detail, but the detail is all available in the issue paper if you need to refer. Now, in terms of identifying whether a transaction arises from a binding arrangement, this definitely sticks out as one of the really key concepts in both the revenue and transfer expense projects. And so what we're proposing is that both of these IPSAS will include IGs relating to how to really consider whether the revenue or transfer expense transaction does or does not arise from a binding arrangement. And so you'll see that that's number one on both of these project pieces. Number two is about changes. And this is a discussion we had in earlier this year relating to any changes and factors that might come up after you've entered into an arrangement, whether that has implications for you on an accounting perspective. Now, this guidance has actually already been written as an IG, reviewed by the drafting group, and also presented to the board in the past for revenue. And so for the transfer expense side, what we would propose is to bring that in, but obviously make the appropriate revisions for the transfer provider perspective to make sure it's applicable for the entity using the transfer expense IPSAS. The second key topic would be on enforceability, which is obviously a very important part of also determining whether you do or don't have a binding arrangement. Now, for enforceability, one of the key things we wanted to highlight in IGs is whether or not a transaction is enforceable. And this has come from a lot of different forms through our discussions about legal and equivalent means, questions we've had from constituents about, sovereign powers. So there's a lot of factors that can impact this assessment enforceability. And because it's a really important assessment, this is why we think an IG would be useful to address this complex area. The second part, if you will, of enforceability is about those transactions that are subject to appropriations. Now, we've talked about appropriations for revenue and for transfer expenses in different ways, but one of the key decisions that came out of June for transfer expenses, which we wanted to bring into revenue for consistency, is we still agree with the application and consideration of appropriations, but we wanted to bring that guidance into IGs. And so we've made sure to make that move consistent. And also the staff will continue to work together to make sure the drafting itself is also consistent where appropriate. Now, for transactions without binding arrangements, on the revenue side specifically, we had noted that there were about 7 or 8 different illustrative examples that were in ED 71, which were brought in from IPSAS 23, which essentially related to the recognition and measurement considerations and application of those accounting principles to revenue transactions without binding arrangements. However, we did note that there was quite a bit of repetition in terms of assessing when do you actually recognize and how much do you recognize based on your estimates and reliable estimates of that amount. And so to stick with the overall approach that the board has taken about let's not be repetitive where we don't need to be. Let's reduce duplication. Staff is proposing that we actually create 2 IGs instead, one on recognition and one on measurement to help cut down on the already voluminous amount of IEs that we had in the existing EDs. In terms of transactions with binding arrangements, for the revenue side, we are proposing 3 IGs relating to recognition. And these are all areas that were considered complex based on discussions we've had with constituents and even discussions within the board itself over the last year or so. And so this relates to step 2, which is identifying compliance obligations and what are individual compliance obligations, and also 2 additional IGs on step 5 of the model, which is about when do you satisfy compliance obligations and therefore recognize revenue, so timing of revenue. Measuring progress, and specifically measuring progress for capital transfers, has been a bit of that sticky area. And so this is where we're going to bring in a bit more clarity on how we expect that these principles would be applied, and also to think about specified activities and eligible expenditures that were quite prevalent in ED 71 and how they still do contribute to thinking and applying the binding arrangement model. The last part for revenue, at least, is 2 additional IGs for measurement. Again, these are areas that were considered difficult to apply in practice and can be complicated. One is estimating the standalone value for allocation purposes, which can be a little tricky in the public sector. And 2, the subsequent measurement of receivables, which was a direct output from the discussions we had at the June session. This IG also has been written already and reviewed by the drafting group. It is available, but we didn't present it this session because we've been focusing on giving authoritative text in the agenda item 6.3.2. Now, if we look at the transfer expense side for transactions with binding arrangements, we're similarly making sure to include IGs on the recognition of such transfer expense transactions. Now, these 4 IGs are actually directly related to decisions and instructions coming out from board discussions since as far back as April 2021. And so these are really in direct reflection of the board's ask. And lastly, 2 more IGs on the measurement of transfer expense transactions with binding arrangements, similarly for the reasons that the board have previously indicated that it's a complex area where additional IG guidance would be useful. So with that, the overall recommendation from staff is to include IGs for revenue, which would be 11 IG topics, and transfer expenses, which are 10 IG topics. Some of these will be consistent, and therefore you will see consistency in the guidance itself as we proceed. But the one thing I did want to flag as well, in addition to this recommendation, is what we noted in the paper about the steps forward on how we're going to handle IEs. Now, because IEs we're proposing to have them identified after we've agreed on this list of IGs and started the work on IGs. And that's because by nature, IEs are often misconstrued as authoritative rules in what are principle-based IPSAS. And so generally, staff's view is that we should try to limit the use of IEs to an as-needed basis. And so that's when the principles that are already in the authoritative guidance and also the additional IGs that we're adding are still considered not clear enough, then that's sort of an indication to us that perhaps an IE would be useful. And the other thing about IEs is that we want to make sure that the fact patterns that are used in these IEs to illustrate the principles do use general case facts. So these facts should be relatively prevalent globally amongst public sector entities to ensure that they're truly useful in thinking through the situations that public sector entities may have in applying these accounting principles. Now, staff will continue to work with the drafting group over the next quarter to draft the agreed upon IGs and also to consider what IEs to retain, what IEs to potentially need to add based on the starting points we had in ED 70, 71, and 72. And we will be compiling this list of IEs for the board's review in a few weeks' time. So with that, I'll pass it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. And perhaps just in terms of opening up the discussion, if you can go back to the previous slide with the list of proposed implementation guidance topics. I think that's very helpful to have that all in one place. And I think just to underline that the consequence of taking this approach is likely to be that there will be a lot fewer implementation examples in the 2 standards, which I think again responds to the point about complexity and from constituents, that you actually get a higher level piece of guidance in terms of IGs, which means we've got a much reduced need for implementation examples, which should be a lot clearer for constituents. So if we can open up for comments then in terms of, do board members see the need for other pieces of implementation guidance on particularly tricky issues that are likely to be prevalent? Lindy.
Thank you very much. The only one I could think of in response to the question is on, and you've got measurement for transactions without binding arrangements. And I wonder if we need to touch on the subsequent measurement where we're saying you use amortized cost by analogy. And perhaps we can give an example on that. Thanks.
Okay, so I think if you can take that away and then have a look at what we've got in terms of authoritative, and then the question is, do we need additional non-authoritative guidance to help in that respect? Okay, Renee?
Yes, so I look at the very end of the table for transfers, transfer expense and capital transfers. We refer to AG 5051 and we conclude no IGs. Could we just put a placeholder there, subject to doing the additional exploration on capital transfers that we may end up wanting an IG? Maybe not.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. I think that was something we noted earlier, that an IG may actually be helpful there in terms of that cash, non-cash consideration point. Todd.
Thanks, Ian. And it was just one thing that I was wondering about in terms of revenue was whether we needed to think about IGs around allocating the transaction consideration to compliance obligations.
Eileen, do you want to come back on that one?
I think it might be something we can add to number 10 there in terms of not only estimating, but also allocating. So we can maybe build it as a part 1, part 2. But I take your point. It's definitely a useful area.
Thanks, Todd. Not seeing any of the flags raised. So I think that's been a useful discussion, and as you know, as staff have said, this is sort of aiming to move us forward, but to provide the guidance that's needed on those tricky areas. Oh, Adrienne, sorry.
Oh, just a practical question. Is it intended that we discuss the narratives of the IGs at the check-in session ahead of the December session?
Eileen, back to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the question, Hervé Adrian. I would refer us back to 6.2.1 in terms of the approach that we wanted to do, which is now that we have these list of IG topics that the boards agreed to, staff will be working closely with the drafting group to draft it. Now, if there's anything during that drafting process where we feel maybe we should run this by the board and make sure we are clearly supporting the principles that we've outlined in the authoritative text, then those would be brought back by exception. But the intention is to kind of follow suit from what we did in IPSASB 41, where the board is really deferring that responsibility of detailed review of the IGs to the drafting group to manage over the next quarter.
So that, you know, any exceptions will then come back for discussion at the December board meeting. Okay, so I think with that, that takes us through the papers on transfer expenses and revenue. Thank you again to staff for those, and thanks very much for the drafting group, which I think has done a lot of work, and I think we see that reflected in the quality of what we've got moving forward. In terms of today's session, obviously that gets us through what we were planning to deliver on. Ross, you're hovering.
Yeah, Ian, we didn't have a chance to talk because we ran ahead, but really great discussions this morning on ED 78. Now that we have a little bit more time this afternoon by ending early, those of you who had comments this morning on ED 78, we'd like to grab you around a lunch table and then continue a discussion afterwards to try and land some of these consistency issues that we talked about and just kind of agree on a way forward. So if you had a lot to say this morning, don't be surprised if you get grabbed by staff and rounded to a table, because we do really want to take advantage of having you here in one place to have those discussions. And I think you know who I'm talking about.
Thanks very much. And I think I'm right in saying there is actually an other lease type arrangements task force, is that right? Or is that?
There is, and I think if it's okay with that task force, if we could keep that time that was already set for that meeting, because I think there is some overlap between the lease type arrangement task force and the people we'd like to talk to on
Yeah.
78.
So I think that was due to start at 3:30. So obviously if we get through the other work, but I think if we can use that time on ED 78, that would be a really good investment. So thanks in advance to those who are going to commit time to that. And I think with that, then in terms of the formal board session, that concludes our discussions for today. We will reconvene as the board at 9 o'clock Lisbon time tomorrow morning when we move into item 7 on reporting sustainability programme information. But in the meantime, thanks everyone for the comments and the great input today. And lunchtime. Thanks.